Hey guys, tonight we're going to find out why an ordinary Roman soldier may have been in a better financial position than you are. Which is slightly awkward, considering his retirement plan depended on not being turned into a human pincushion by a very enthusiastic bearded barbarian who hadn't enjoyed Rome's latest expansion project. So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Imagine you're about 18 years old, somewhere in the Roman Empire during the reign of Emperor Trajan. You wake up before sunrise, not because you're disciplined, but because your family's rooster has once again mistaken 3 in the morning for dawn. He's been wrong every day for the past 2 years, yet his confidence remains inspiring. You stretch, look across your family's tiny farm, and immediately spot several problems. The roof leaks. The harvest looks average at best. One of the goats has escaped again. Your father has already begun muttering about taxes, and it isn't even breakfast yet. Welcome to civilian life. If you don't inherit enough land, which most people didn't, your options are fairly limited. You can become a labourer, hoping someone needs an extra pair of hands. You can try learning a trade, assuming someone is willing to teach you. Or you can continue farming, gambling your entire future against weather that seems to hold a personal grudge against your village. Then Rome arrives. One afternoon, a column of legionaries marches through town. Their armour gleams in the sun. Their shields are polished. They walk in perfect formation, looking like the ancient world's most intimidating synchronized dance group. Children stare in amazement. Merchants stop what they're doing. Even the village dogs think twice before barking. Behind them comes the recruiter. He's charming. He's confident. He tells you the army offers regular pay, guaranteed food, proper clothing, opportunities for promotion, and enough adventure to make sure no 2 years look exactly alike. Curiously, he spends very little time discussing dysentery. He also forgets to mention that you'll occasionally carry nearly 60 pounds of equipment across mountains because someone hundreds of miles away drew a line on a map and declared, "We own that now." Recruiters, it seems, have changed remarkably little over the last 2,000 years. Still, the offer is difficult to ignore. For an ordinary young Roman, joining the army wasn't simply about becoming a soldier. It was about escaping uncertainty. Every harvest no longer determined whether your family ate well that winter. Every drought no longer threatened your income. Rome, the wealthiest state in the Mediterranean, would become your employer. Think about that for a moment. Today, people proudly announce they've landed a stable government job because it comes with decent benefits and a pension. The Romans looked at that idea and said, "Excellent, now put on 40 kilograms of equipment and march 20 miles before lunch." Once accepted, you swear the sacramentum, the military oath. From that moment, your loyalty belongs to Rome. You are no longer simply a farmer's son or a village blacksmith's apprentice. You are a legionary. It's a serious commitment. During much of the empire, you'll serve around 25 years. That's long enough to watch emperors come and go, fashions change, and your knees begin filing formal complaints every morning. In return, Rome promises something astonishing for the ancient world: consistency. You receive regular wages. Your meals are supplied. Your clothing is issued. Medical care is available. You sleep inside fortified camps protected by thousands of fellow soldiers. No landlord suddenly doubles your rent because the neighborhood is improving. Mostly because your neighborhood is a fortress surrounded by ditches and watchtowers. Of course, life isn't luxurious. Your roommates snore like catapults under construction. Privacy is almost mythical. Your alarm clock is a centurion with absolutely no interest in your sleep schedule. And if someone announces you're marching 30 miles today, that isn't a suggestion or a motivational fitness challenge. Yet compared with millions of civilians struggling to survive from one harvest to the next, you have something priceless: predictability. And here's where things become genuinely surprising. When historians calculate what your salary could actually buy, not just the number of coins you received, but the food, clothing, housing, savings and retirement waiting at the end. You begin looking less like an underpaid infantryman and more like someone whose financial planning might embarrass quite a few people carrying laptops instead of shields. Now that you've survived recruitment without asking too many awkward questions, it's finally payday. You picture yourself walking into headquarters, collecting a heavy pouch of silver coins, and immediately planning your financial future. Rome has other ideas. Under Emperor Augustus, a legionary earned about 225 denarii a year. Later, emperors gradually increased this. Domitian raised it to 300 denarii. Septimius Severus nearly doubled it again. At first glance, those numbers don't mean much, but compared to many ordinary labourers, it represented a respectable and dependable income. The important word is dependable. Most civilians didn't know exactly what they would earn next month. Farmers depended on the weather. Merchants depended on customers. Fishermen depended on the sea deciding not to become angry. You depended on Rome. And Rome, despite occasionally collapsing into civil wars or having emperors assassinated every few years, was surprisingly reliable when it came to paying its army. After all, nothing motivates thousands of armed professionals to reconsider their career choices quite like missing payday. Your salary usually arrived in installments rather than one enormous annual payment. When the pay chest reached the fort, soldiers gathered while officers carefully distributed the money. It was an exciting day. It was also the day reality arrived. Before you could even admire your shiny silver coins, deductions began. Food? Deducted. Clothing? Deducted. Replacement boots? Deducted. Equipment repairs? Also deducted. If your helmet needed fixing because a Germanic warrior had introduced an axe to it during the previous campaign, congratulations. Payroll had already noticed. Roman accountants would probably have loved modern subscription services. They clearly believed every enjoyable experience should come with another unexpected charge. Even after deductions, however, you usually kept a healthy portion of your wages. Better still, you weren't spending half your income on rent. You weren't buying expensive groceries every week. You weren't paying for heating, water, insurance, or discovering that your washing machine had chosen violence on a Sunday afternoon. Most of your basic necessities were already provided inside the fort. That completely changes the picture. Imagine earning a salary while your employer also supplies housing, much of your food, clothing, healthcare, and equipment. Suddenly, every coin you don't spend has somewhere to go. Savings. And Roman soldiers became surprisingly good at it. Some deposited money into military savings accounts managed within the camp. Others accumulated silver over years of service, carefully protecting it until retirement. A few even lent money to fellow soldiers or local civilians, quietly becoming investors long before anyone had invented spreadsheets or people on the internet claiming they could make you rich in 6 easy steps. The paycheck itself was respectable. But the real secret to a legionary's wealth wasn't how much he earned. It was how little he actually needed to spend. If someone handed you a Roman soldier's paycheck without any context, you probably wouldn't be terribly impressed. A few silver coins. Certainly not enough to buy a villa overlooking the Bay of Naples, complete with marble columns and servants dramatically announcing your arrival every time you walked into a room. But here's the mistake almost everyone makes. People compare salaries instead of expenses. Imagine you earn a respectable income today, but every month your rent disappears into someone else's bank account. Then come electricity, heating, internet, groceries, insurance, fuel, taxes, and that mysterious charge on your credit card that you're fairly sure wasn't there yesterday. By the time you've paid everything, your wallet has become little more than an archaeological site. A Roman legionary lived very differently. Your employer already gave you a place to sleep inside the fortress. It wasn't luxurious, of course. You shared a barrack room with 7 other soldiers, meaning personal space was roughly equal to what modern airline passengers enjoy after the person in front reclines their seat. Privacy barely existed. If you wanted a quiet evening alone with your thoughts, Rome politely suggested becoming a hermit after retirement. Still, the accommodation cost you almost nothing. The same was true for much of your food. Every month, grain formed the foundation of your diet. Wheat was distributed regularly, allowing you and your tent mates to prepare bread, porridge, or other simple meals. Additional supplies included salt, vinegar, olive oil, cheese, vegetables, and occasionally meat, especially after successful campaigns or special celebrations. No one was opening a menu and wondering whether to spend 18 denarii on artisanal sourdough. Dinner was whatever the army issued. Your clothing was also largely standardized. Tunics, cloaks, sandals, belts, and equipment followed military regulations. Replacements weren't always free, and deductions certainly appeared on your pay, but the overall cost remained far below what an ordinary civilian might spend maintaining a wardrobe suitable for work. Which wasn't difficult, since every day your fashion choices consisted of wearing exactly what the centurion expected. Roman military style wasn't about expressing yourself. It was about making 8,000 men look equally terrifying from a distance. Healthcare offered another surprising advantage. Military doctors, known as medici, accompanied the legions. They stitched wounds, treated broken bones, removed arrows with varying degrees of optimism, and helped soldiers recover from disease whenever possible. Ancient medicine had obvious limits, but access to trained medical personnel was far better than what many civilians enjoyed. Taken together, these benefits transformed your finances. Because wealth isn't only measured by what you earn, it's measured by what you get to keep. While countless civilians watched their income disappear, simply trying to survive another season, you finished each payday with most of your essential needs already covered. For perhaps the first time in your life, saving money wasn't an impossible dream. It became part of the job description. By now, you might be thinking you've stumbled across history's greatest financial loophole. Steady income, low living expenses, employer-provided housing, food included, medical care available, a retirement package waiting at the finish line. You're already wondering whether Rome is still accepting applications. Not so fast, because every benefit came with a price that never appeared on your paycheck. Let's start with your working hours. Forget the modern concept of a 40-hour work week. Forget weekends. Forget asking your supervisor if you can leave early because you have a family commitment. Your family commitment is now the Roman Empire. You wake before sunrise to the sound of a horn echoing through the fort. Within minutes, thousands of men are already moving. Some report for guard duty. Others repair walls. Others train with swords and shields. Someone is chopping wood. Someone is digging another ditch. Someone is always digging another ditch. Roman generals seemed convinced that if soldiers weren't currently digging, civilization itself might collapse. Training never really stops. You practice marching. Then you practice fighting. Then you practice throwing the pilum, Rome's famous heavy javelin. Then you march again, because apparently the first march was only a warm-up. A full marching pack can weigh 60 pounds or more. Armor, helmet, shield, weapons, tools, cooking equipment, spare clothing, food. You carry nearly everything yourself. Modern hikers proudly post pictures after walking 15 kilometers on a sunny Saturday. You do that before lunch, sometimes in full armor, sometimes uphill, sometimes while it's raining, and occasionally someone at the front of the column announces that the destination has changed. Nobody applauds. Then there's discipline. Roman military discipline became legendary because it had to. An army this large could only function if everyone obeyed orders instantly. Arrive late for duty? Expect punishment. Lose your equipment? Punishment. Fall asleep while standing guard? That mistake could cost hundreds of lives, so the consequences could be severe. Even minor offences often meant extra duties, reduced privileges, or public humiliation in front of your fellow soldiers. Your centurion wasn't interested in motivational speeches. His leadership philosophy could usually be summarized as, do it correctly the first time. Yet despite the exhausting routine, soldiers stayed. Why? Because every difficult day brought them closer to something civilians rarely enjoyed. Security. They knew food would arrive tomorrow. They knew their wages would eventually arrive. They knew retirement if they survived, promised land or cash waiting at the end. For millions of ordinary Romans living from harvest to harvest, Nothing in life was guaranteed. For you, almost everything was. Ironically, that's one of history's oldest financial lessons. Sometimes becoming wealthier has less to do with earning spectacular amounts of money than with having predictable income and fewer unpleasant surprises. Unless, of course, your unpleasant surprise happened to be several thousand barbarians appearing over the next hill. Unfortunately, no pension plan completely covers that. Now comes the question that really matters. It's one thing to know your salary. It's another to know what that salary could actually buy. After all, earning 1 million coins doesn't make you wealthy if a loaf of bread costs 999,000 of them. Inflation has been ruining perfectly good conversations for thousands of years. Fortunately for you, the Roman economy remained fairly stable during much of the early empire, especially under emperors like Augustus and Trajan. Prices certainly varied from province to province, but historians have gathered enough evidence from military records, papyri, and surviving receipts to paint a surprisingly clear picture. Let's go shopping. A modius of wheat, enough to feed one person for several days, cost only a fraction of a denarius. Bread remained affordable. Olive oil, one of the staples of Roman cooking, wasn't cheap, but it was well within your reach. Wine, usually mixed with water because Romans considered drinking it straight rather uncivilized, was inexpensive enough that even ordinary soldiers could enjoy it regularly. Good news. Because after marching 20 miles carrying your entire life on your back, watered-down wine somehow becomes 5-star dining. Meat was more expensive than grain, but certainly not reserved only for the wealthy. Pork was common throughout the empire. Beef appeared less frequently. Fish depended largely on where you were stationed, while cheese, beans, onions, garlic and lentils regularly filled military kitchens. Your diet wasn't luxurious, but neither was it the endless bowl of grey porridge that films often like to imagine. A Roman soldier usually ate better than many poor civilians. Clothing tells another interesting story. A quality wool tunic represented a noticeable expense, but you weren't constantly buying fashionable outfits every season. Roman military fashion changed at approximately the same speed as a mountain. Nobody woke up saying, "This year's sandals are completely out of style." If they did, the centurion probably assigned them extra ditch digging until the feeling passed. Now compare that to the average labourer. A civilian builder or farm worker often found employment only when work was available. Bad weather meant fewer jobs. Poor harvests meant higher food prices. Illness meant no income at all. You, meanwhile, continued receiving wages. Even if you were stationed on the cold frontier of Britain, where sunshine became more of a historical rumour than a daily event. By modern standards, your income might appear ordinary. Your purchasing power, however, was anything but ordinary. Because with food heavily subsidised, housing provided, clothing partially supplied, and stable employment guaranteed, each silver coin stretched remarkably far. And that's the difference between earning money and actually getting to keep enough of it to build a future. If your regular salary made military service attractive, the bonuses made it genuinely exciting. Not because they happened every week, far from it, but every Roman soldier knew that one day, if fortune smiled and politics behaved themselves for at least 5 minutes, an emperor might suddenly decide to hand out a small fortune. This gift was known as the donativum. Imagine waking up one morning expecting another routine day of drills, inspections, and trying to figure out which of your roommates had somehow made sandals smell worse than usual. Instead, word spreads through the camp. The emperor has announced a bonus. Suddenly morale improves at a speed that no inspirational speech could ever achieve. Funny how money has always been an excellent motivational tool. The donativum wasn't guaranteed. It usually appeared after a new emperor took the throne, following a major military victory, or during important anniversaries. In many cases, it was less of a generous gift and more of a practical investment. After all, if you were becoming emperor, the first people you wanted on your side were the hundreds of thousands of heavily armed professionals scattered across the empire. Winning elections is nice. Winning the army is considerably safer. Some emperors were famously generous. Claudius rewarded the troops after securing the throne. Trajan earned enormous popularity by sharing the wealth generated through successful campaigns. Septimius Severus practically told his sons that keeping the army happy was one of the keys to holding power. History suggests he wasn't wrong. Sometimes these bonuses equaled several years of ordinary wages. Imagine your employer suddenly announcing, "Congratulations, here's 2 years' salary." You would probably check whether the email was a scam. Roman soldiers simply lined up and accepted the silver. Of course, the money rarely stayed untouched. Many bought better personal equipment or replacement animals. Others sent money home to parents, wives, or children. Some invested in land for the day they finally retired. And naturally, some celebrated. Roman taverns became noticeably busier after bonus payments. Coincidentally, so did local headaches the following morning. Yet even soldiers who enjoyed a good celebration often understood something important. Bonuses were temporary. Saving them created opportunities. By the time a veteran completed decades of service, careful saving combined with regular wages and occasional donativa could produce an impressive amount of wealth. Certainly not enough to purchase half the empire, but enough to buy land. Enough to build a comfortable home. Enough to start a business. Enough to give your children a better beginning than you had. For many recruits who had arrived with little more than the clothes on their backs, that transformation was extraordinary. Rome didn't simply pay its soldiers. Sometimes it gave them the chance to climb an entire social class, one silver coin at a time. After years of marching across mountains, crossing rivers, building forts, and becoming strangely enthusiastic about digging ditches, retirement finally appears on the horizon. You probably can't believe it. Your knees certainly can't. For roughly 25 years, you've obeyed orders, survived battles, stood guard through freezing nights, and eaten enough army bread to recognize individual grains of wheat by name. Now Rome is about to keep one of its biggest promises. Unlike many civilians, who often worked until age or illness forced them to stop, you actually had a retirement plan. An official one. When a legionary completed his service honorably, he was discharged with a ceremony known as the Onesta Missio, literally an honorable release. It wasn't simply a handshake and a polite good luck. Rome rewarded loyalty. Veterans often received a substantial cash payment, a grant of land, or sometimes both, depending on the emperor and the period. Augustus even established a special military treasury, the Aerarium Militare, specifically to help ensure veterans received what they had been promised. Think about that. The Roman government created an entire fund dedicated to military pensions almost 2,000 years ago. Meanwhile, modern governments occasionally look at pension systems the way people look at assembling furniture without instructions, with visible concern. The amount you received wasn't enough to make you one of Rome's richest citizens, but it was enough to change your life. Many veterans used the money to purchase farms. Others opened workshops, taverns, or trading businesses. Some settled in newly founded colonies alongside fellow veterans, creating communities filled with men who had spent decades serving together. It was rather like moving into a neighborhood where everyone had the same stories, the same bad knees, and the same habit of waking up before sunrise, even though nobody was blowing a military horn anymore. Old habits are difficult to retire. Even more valuable than the money was the stability it created. Instead of beginning middle age with nothing but hope, you started with savings, experience, and valuable connections across the empire. You also possessed practical skills. You knew engineering. You knew construction. You understood logistics, organization, surveying, road building, and leadership. The Roman army had accidentally spent 25 years giving you one of the best vocational educations available in the ancient world. Of course, not every veteran became prosperous. Some struggled. Some settled in difficult frontier regions. Others discovered that farming looked much easier when someone else was doing it. Still, compared with millions of ordinary laborers who reached old age with little to fall back on, you finished your career with something remarkably rare: a pension, savings, and the realistic possibility of owning your own land. Suddenly, that young man who had once worried whether the next harvest would feed his family had become something else entirely. not just a retired soldier. A financially secure citizen with a future that many of his civilian neighbours could only dream about. Not every Roman soldier retired to a quiet little farm with a few chickens and a respectable collection of back pain. Some became genuinely wealthy. And no, we're not talking about emperors, senators, or aristocrats born with silver spoons and several vineyards already waiting for them. We're talking about ordinary soldiers who climbed the ranks. Take the centurion, for example. If you're imagining a man who commanded exactly 100 soldiers, history is about to disappoint you slightly. The title survived from earlier times, but by the imperial period, a centurion's command varied considerably. What never varied was his importance. He was the backbone of the Roman army. Your centurion trains you. He disciplines you. He decides whether today's march feels merely exhausting or absolutely unforgettable. And if you've somehow managed to polish your helmet badly enough to offend the dignity of Rome itself, he'll certainly let you know. Centurions earned dramatically more than ordinary legionaries. Depending on the period, some received 15 times the salary of a regular soldier, while the most senior officers earned even more. They occupied larger quarters, enjoyed greater prestige, and often accumulated impressive fortunes during long careers. Suddenly, military promotion wasn't just about glory, it was about financial freedom. Then there was the Praetorian Guard. These elite soldiers served as the emperor's personal bodyguards, usually stationed near Rome itself. They received higher pay, shorter terms of service, and frequent bonuses whenever a new emperor wished to ensure the loyalty of the men standing closest to his bedroom. It was probably one of history's most stressful security jobs. Your performance review could literally change the government. Some soldiers also discovered opportunities beyond their official salary. Around military forts, entire towns sprang into existence. Merchants, craftsmen, blacksmiths, tavern owners, bakers and traders all wanted the business of thousands of men receiving regular wages. Where soldiers gathered, business followed. Many legionaries quietly invested in local enterprises, through trusted friends or family members. Others raised livestock while stationed in peaceful provinces. Some learned valuable crafts from military engineers and later earned additional income making tools, wagons, furniture, or building materials. Even after retirement, those skills remained valuable. The Roman army wasn't simply teaching you how to fight. It was teaching you how to organize people, solve problems, construct roads, bridges, forts and aqueducts, manage supplies, and lead large groups under pressure. Modern employers would probably describe that as excellent transferable skills. Rome simply called it Tuesday. Of course, not everyone became rich. Promotion was competitive. Many soldiers finished their careers as ordinary legionaries. But here's the remarkable part. Even those who never rose through the ranks often ended their working lives with greater savings, more valuable experience, and better long-term security than countless civilians who had spent the same 25 years working just as hard without ever escaping poverty. In Rome, the fastest road to prosperity wasn't always through politics or inheritance. Sometimes it began by picking up a shield. So far we've spent a great deal of time looking at your comfortable military paycheck. Now let's meet the people you left behind. Because understanding why a Roman soldier could become financially secure only makes sense once you compare him to the average civilian. Let's begin with the farmer. Not the wealthy landowner with marble floors and dozens of servants. The ordinary farmer. The man who owns a tiny plot of land. Or perhaps rents one from somebody considerably richer. Every year his livelihood depends on rain arriving at the right time, the river behaving itself, insects staying somewhere else, and his neighbours deciding not to steal his sheep. It's a surprisingly stressful business. Modern investors worry when the stock market drops 3%. Just when you're feeling rather pleased with your Roman financial situation, it's time to introduce one of history's most consistent characters, the tax collector. Don't worry, he's been making unpopular first impressions for thousands of years. The Roman Empire depended on taxes to build roads, maintain aqueducts, supply cities, and, rather importantly, pay people like you. Empires, it turns out, are surprisingly expensive to operate. The interesting part is who carried most of that burden. If you were an ordinary civilian, taxes could feel relentless. Farmers paid land taxes. Many provinces collected poll taxes. Merchants paid customs duties when goods crossed frontiers. Traders faced port fees. Shopkeepers dealt with local charges. Even moving goods from one place to another could involve handing over a portion of your profits. Imagine finally earning a little extra money, only to discover someone from the government has arrived to congratulate you by taking part of it. Some traditions never truly disappear. As a serving legionary, however, your situation was rather different. You still had deductions from your salary for equipment and supplies, but because so much of your daily life was already organized by the military, you avoided many of the financial headaches that ordinary civilians faced every single year. You weren't negotiating rent. You weren't worrying whether grain prices had suddenly doubled after a poor harvest. You weren't wondering if your business would survive another season. Rome had effectively removed many of the largest financial uncertainties from your life. That predictability was worth more than many people realize. Imagine knowing exactly where your next meal is coming from. Imagine knowing exactly where you'll sleep tonight. Imagine knowing your employer isn't going bankrupt next month because customers have stopped showing up. For millions of civilians, those questions never completely disappeared. For you, they mostly did. Even better, soldiers often found themselves stationed in prosperous frontier regions where merchants eagerly followed the army. Entire towns grew outside military forts because everyone understood one simple fact. Soldiers always had money to spend. A baker opening shop beside a legionary fortress knew he would never lack customers. The local tavern owner certainly wasn't complaining either, although he may have wished soldiers sang slightly less after several cups of wine. Military camps became economic engines. Blacksmiths made weapons and tools. Leatherworkers produced belts and sandals. Builders constructed homes, baths, and warehouses. Farmers sold grain, vegetables, and livestock. Your steady income quietly supported thousands of civilian jobs. Ironically, while Rome paid you to defend the empire, your paycheck also helped keep its economy moving. That's one reason historians sometimes describe the Roman army as something far greater than a fighting force. It was also one of the largest employers, consumers, and financial stabilizers in the ancient world. And if you're wondering why so many young men volunteered despite the danger, the answer becomes clearer every chapter. The army wasn't just offering adventure, it was offering something that money alone could never buy: economic certainty. At this point, you might be thinking the Roman army had accidentally invented the perfect career: steady pay, affordable living, bonuses, a pension, reliable employment. Surely there had to be a catch. There was. A very large one. Your life no longer belonged to you. As a civilian, you could wake up one morning and decide to visit relatives in the next village. You could change jobs, move somewhere warmer, spend a lazy afternoon fishing if work happened to be slow. As a legionary, absolutely not. If your commanding officer announced that tomorrow you are marching 500 miles to the Danube frontier, then congratulations, you're marching to the Danube. If he announced your legion was sailing to Syria, North Africa, or Britain, your opinion would receive approximately the same amount of consideration as the camp donkeys. The Roman army paid well because it demanded complete control over your life. Even marriage reflected this. For much of the early empire, ordinary legionaries were officially forbidden to marry while serving. That didn't stop many soldiers from forming long-term relationships with local women near the forts, and many raised families despite the rules. But legally, things became complicated. Imagine explaining to your children that Rome recognizes your sword more officially than your wedding. Bureaucracy has always found creative ways to confuse people. Then there was the question of where you lived. You didn't choose. The army did. One decade you might enjoy the sunshine of Hispania. The next you could be standing on a rain-soaked wall in northern Britain wondering whether the sun had permanently resigned. Some soldiers spent years along the Rhine, watching dense forests stretch toward the horizon. Others guarded deserts in Egypt, where shade became one of humanity's greatest inventions. Your workplace changed. You simply followed it. And yet, despite giving up so much personal freedom, recruits kept arriving year after year. Why? Because stability has enormous value. Imagine asking an ordinary Roman farmer if he would accept 25 years of strict discipline in exchange for guaranteed food, reliable wages, retirement savings, and the realistic chance of owning land afterward. Many didn't need much time to think. For them, uncertainty was exhausting. The army offered certainty. That certainty extended beyond money. You knew your role. You knew your future. You knew exactly what was expected of you every single day. There was comfort in that structure, even if the structure occasionally involved carrying 60 pounds of equipment through freezing rain because an ambitious governor wanted to impress the emperor. The irony is fascinating. Many people today spend years searching for financial security while enjoying complete personal freedom. A Roman legionary often experienced the opposite. He surrendered much of his freedom in exchange for financial security that millions of civilians could only dream of. And for many recruits, it was a trade they considered entirely worthwhile. By now, becoming a Roman soldier probably sounds like one of the smartest financial decisions available in the ancient world. And for many men, it genuinely was. But there was one tiny detail that had a habit of ruining even the best retirement plans. You had to survive long enough to collect them. It's easy to picture the Roman army as one endless series of glorious victories, gleaming armor, perfect formations, triumphant marches through conquered cities. Reality was rather muddier, quite literally. Most campaigns involved far more walking than fighting. Weeks became months, months became years. You crossed rivers with freezing water up to your waist. You climbed mountain passes where every step threatened to send you tumbling into history. You camped in forests alive with insects that seemed personally offended by your existence. No one wrote heroic poems about blisters. Yet, every legionary had them. Disease was often a greater enemy than any opposing army. A crowded military camp was an ideal place for illnesses to spread. Dysentery, malaria in certain provinces, respiratory infections, and contaminated water could quietly kill far more soldiers than swords ever managed. Imagine surviving 3 battles, only to lose an argument with bad drinking water. History has an unusually dark sense of humour. Accidents were equally common. Axes slipped while cutting timber. Walls collapsed during construction. Horses threw riders. Heavy equipment crushed feet and hands. The Roman army wasn't only a fighting force, it was also one of the largest construction companies in the ancient world, and construction has never been famous for being risk-free. Then came the campaigns themselves. Some enemies fled before the disciplined advance of the legions. Others refused. Battles against the Dacians, Parthians, Germanic tribes, or rebellious provinces could be brutally costly. Even victory carried a price. A shield could stop many things, but not every spear, arrow, or unlucky moment. Each time the trumpet sounded for battle, no soldier knew whether he would still be standing when the sun went down. That's what made the pension so remarkable. Rome wasn't rewarding an easy career. It was rewarding endurance. Every year you remained alive brought you one step closer to financial security that countless civilians never achieved. Every campaign survived meant another year's wages, another opportunity to save, another chance to eventually own land and begin a peaceful life. And perhaps that's why Roman veterans earned such enormous respect. People didn't simply admire their courage, they admired what it had cost. Because behind every retired legionary was a quarter century of hardship, discipline, sacrifice, and more than a little luck. So yes, a Roman soldier could retire wealthier than many ordinary civilians. But unlike a comfortable office job, this career required something far more valuable than silver. It required gambling your life against fate and somehow winning often enough to reach retirement day. Now comes the dangerous part. The internet loves bold statements. You're poorer than a Roman soldier. It's a fantastic title. It's also a claim that deserves a closer look. After all, you probably own things no Roman emperor could have imagined. You have instant communication, electricity, clean running water, vaccines, air conditioning. You can travel hundreds of miles in a single day without marching in sandals. Although airports sometimes make you wonder whether walking might actually have been faster. So, clearly you aren't poorer in every sense. But financially, the comparison becomes surprisingly interesting. Let's imagine you're an average legionary under Emperor Trajan. Your basic needs are largely covered. You receive steady wages. Your employer provides housing. Much of your food is supplied. Healthcare exists within the army. You receive bonuses from time to time. And if you survive long enough, retirement comes with land or a generous cash reward. Now imagine a modern worker. He earns a respectable salary. Then rent arrives, mortgage payments, electricity, gas, water, internet, insurance, car payments, fuel, groceries, taxes, phone bills, subscription services he forgot he was paying for 3 years ago. By the end of the month, his paycheck has performed what historians technically describe as a complete disappearance. The Roman soldier certainly had deductions. But the scale wasn't remotely the same. His largest expenses simply didn't exist. He wasn't competing in an overheated housing market. He wasn't paying interest on loans. He wasn't wondering whether buying eggs now required speaking with a financial advisor. Most importantly, he could actually save. Historians examining military records frequently find evidence that soldiers accumulated respectable amounts of money throughout their careers. Some deposited savings with military officials. Others sent money home. Many retired with enough wealth to purchase farmland and begin entirely new lives. That's something many modern workers struggle to imagine. Not because they earn too little, but because their expenses grow almost as quickly as their income. Of course, there are limits to this comparison. A Roman soldier couldn't simply resign after a stressful week. He couldn't ask for remote work. He certainly couldn't send his centurion an email saying, "I won't be marching tomorrow because I'm focusing on my work-life balance." His work-life balance usually involved work, and then more work. Yet when we strip away modern conveniences and focus purely on personal finances, purchasing power, savings, and long-term security, the Roman legionary begins looking surprisingly competitive. Not because he earned extraordinary amounts of money, but because Rome built a system where ordinary soldiers had a realistic chance to accumulate wealth. Ironically, that may be the biggest surprise of all. The ancient world often gave its soldiers something that many modern economies struggle to provide: a clear path from an ordinary paycheck to genuine financial security. After spending a lifetime following the money through the Roman Empire, one lesson becomes impossible to ignore. The Romans understood something that many people still struggle to appreciate today. Being wealthy wasn't simply about earning more. It was about reducing uncertainty. Imagine two men. The first earns an impressive income, but every month he's worried about rent increasing, food becoming more expensive, unexpected repairs, medical bills, and whether his employer will still need him next year. The second earns less, but he knows exactly where he'll sleep tonight. He knows he'll eat tomorrow. He knows his job will continue next month. He knows that if he keeps doing his duty, retirement is waiting. Which one sleeps better? Probably not the first. The Roman army didn't make you rich overnight. It made your future predictable. That predictability allowed something remarkable to happen. Compound savings. No, the Romans didn't call it compound interest, and they certainly weren't watching videos explaining how to become a millionaire before turning 30. They simply kept saving. Year after year, campaign after campaign, bonus after bonus. While other people were forced to spend nearly everything they earned just staying alive, many legionaries slowly accumulated wealth almost without realizing it. Time became their greatest ally. There's another fascinating detail. Roman soldiers rarely chased luxury. Most couldn't. There were no luxury sports chariots, no designer sandals endorsed by famous gladiators, no influencer convincing you that buying a 5th bronze statue would finally complete your personality. Life inside a military camp naturally limited unnecessary spending. Your entertainment came from conversations, gambling with dice, writing letters, exercising, visiting nearby taverns, or listening to stories from veterans who somehow defeated 30 enemies single-handedly every time they retold the tale. Curiously, the number of enemies always increased after the 3rd cup of wine. Without endless opportunities to spend money, saving became much easier. Modern economists sometimes call this forced saving. Roman soldiers simply called it another Tuesday. Perhaps that's why archaeologists occasionally discover buried hoards of Roman silver belonging to veterans or serving soldiers. Some were hidden during invasions and never recovered. Others represented years of disciplined saving. Each coin tells the same quiet story. Someone was planning for tomorrow, and maybe that's the biggest financial lesson Rome accidentally left behind. Most fortunes aren't built by spectacular moments. They're built through ordinary habits repeated over very long periods. A little saved this month, a little more next month. Another bonus carefully put aside. Another campaign completed. Another year closer to retirement. It isn't particularly glamorous. It certainly wouldn't go viral on social media. But 2,000 years later, it's still one of the most reliable ways ordinary people improve their financial lives. The Roman legionary didn't become financially secure because he discovered a secret. He became financially secure because he stayed patient long enough for small advantages to become enormous ones. So, after everything we've explored, are you actually poorer than a Roman soldier? The honest answer is both yes and no. If we compare comfort, medicine, technology, education, and sheer life expectancy, you win by an astonishing margin. A Roman soldier would gladly trade his iron helmet for antibiotics. He'd probably exchange his hobnailed sandals for a decent pair of running shoes before you even finished explaining what rubber is. And after experiencing central heating for the first time, he'd likely refuse to return to the 2nd century under any circumstances. But that's not really what this journey has been about. We've been talking about financial security, and that's where the Roman legionary begins to look surprisingly modern. He knew what he would earn, he knew where he would sleep, he knew he would eat. He knew that if he survived his years of service, there was a realistic reward waiting at the end. Most importantly, he could plan. The future wasn't a mystery, it was a roadmap. That certainty is incredibly valuable. In fact, historians often argue that one of Rome's greatest strengths wasn't simply its military discipline. It was its ability to convince ordinary people that loyalty today could create a better tomorrow. The army wasn't merely buying soldiers, it was selling hope. not empty promises. Actual opportunities. A poor farmer's son could retire owning land. An ordinary recruit could become a respected centurion. A man who arrived with almost nothing could leave with savings, skills, and enough experience to build an entirely new life. That kind of social mobility was rare in the ancient world. It remains surprisingly difficult in many places today. Of course, none of it came free. You surrendered your freedom, you obeyed every order, you marched wherever Rome demanded. You accepted years of danger, discomfort, separation from family, and the constant possibility that your next campaign would be your last. There were no guarantees. The pension only mattered if you lived long enough to collect it. Perhaps that's the greatest irony of all. The Roman soldier wasn't financially successful because life was easier. He was financially successful because he accepted extraordinary hardship in exchange for extraordinary stability. And maybe that's the lesson still worth remembering 2,000 years later. Real wealth has never been measured only by the size of a paycheck. It's measured by what that paycheck allows you to build. Security, opportunity, peace of mind, the confidence that next year can be better than this one. The Roman Empire understood that remarkably well. Its soldiers weren't the richest people in the ancient world, not even close. But for an ordinary young man born without wealth or status, they may have had something even more valuable, a genuine path to a better life. And perhaps that's the most surprising discovery of all. The man carrying 60 pounds of armour across Europe wasn't simply defending an empire. Without realising it, he was also building one of history's most reliable middle-class careers, proof that sometimes the greatest treasure isn't a chest full of silver, but the rare certainty that tomorrow will be just a little more secure than today. Tonight we're travelling to ancient Egypt to answer a question that might make your manager mysteriously stop recommending this channel. How did the people who built pyramids, carved colossal temples, and created one of history's greatest civilizations somehow end up with more time off than many of us today? So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Picture yourself waking just before sunrise in ancient Egypt. The first rays of light spill across the Nile, turning the river into a ribbon of gold. Palm trees sway gently in the morning breeze, birds chatter from the reeds, and somewhere nearby, a donkey has already decided today is the perfect day to file a formal complaint with the entire village. The donkey has many opinions. None of them are useful. You stretch, step outside your mud brick home, and prepare yourself for another day of work. At least, that's what you expect. If you've clicked on this video imagining ancient Egyptians spending every daylight hour dragging enormous limestone blocks through the desert, while a furious overseer shouted motivational phrases that would definitely violate modern workplace policies, you're in for a surprise. It's one of history's most persistent myths. The pyramids are so famous that they've completely overshadowed the lives of the millions of ordinary people who never laid a hand on one. The truth is, you probably aren't a pyramid builder. Instead, you're much more likely to be a farmer, a potter, a brewer, a fisherman, a carpenter, or, if fortune smiles upon you, a scribe. Becoming a scribe is rather like discovering the office job of the ancient world. You spend less time lifting heavy objects and more time making sure everyone else knows exactly how many heavy objects they were supposed to lift. Your greatest physical challenge is occasionally running out of ink. Whatever your profession, your life isn't controlled by a 5-day work week, an alarm clock, or someone asking if you have just 5 minutes for a quick meeting. Ancient Egypt has no meetings that could have been an inscription. Instead, your schedule follows something far older and far more reliable: the Nile. Unlike modern calendars, where every Monday somehow arrives with remarkable confidence despite nobody inviting it, the Egyptian year rises and falls with the river. Nature decides when work begins, when it slows, and when it stops altogether. You can argue with your supervisor. You cannot argue with several billion tons of water. That changes everything. Of course, don't imagine life is one endless holiday beside the river. Fields still need planting, canals must be maintained, livestock cared for, bread baked, beer brewed, tools repaired, and houses patched after every season. Ancient Egypt survived for more than 3,000 years because ordinary people were exceptionally good at their jobs, but they were also practical. When the Nile flooded, vast stretches of farmland disappeared beneath water. You cannot plough a field that has temporarily become part of the river. You also can't complain that the crops are behind schedule when the crops are technically underwater. Even the strictest foreman has to admit defeat at that point. For many farming communities, this meant that the pace of life changed dramatically during different seasons. Some months demanded exhausting labour from sunrise until dusk. Others offered unexpected breathing room, opportunities to repair equipment, work on public projects, visit relatives, attend festivals, or simply enjoy a slower rhythm while waiting for the floodwaters to retreat. Imagine telling your boss, "I'd love to finish that project, but the Nile has swallowed my entire workplace." For once, that isn't an excuse. It's geography. Over the next few chapters, you'll discover that the ancient Egyptian calendar wasn't built around quarterly targets, productivity charts, or the mysterious modern tradition of pretending every email is urgent. It revolved around floods, harvests, religious celebrations, and a deep understanding that life moved in cycles rather than non-stop deadlines. Ironically, the people who built one of history's greatest civilizations also seem to understand something many of us are still trying to learn. Working hard doesn't necessarily mean working every single day until you forget what free time feels like. Ancient Egyptians certainly knew how to labour. They just also knew when even the river was telling everyone to take a break. Now that you've discovered your life isn't spent endlessly hauling pyramid stones across the desert, it's time to meet your real supervisor. The Nile. Unlike modern employers, the Nile doesn't send emails at 11 o'clock at night, or schedule meetings that could have been a 2-sentence conversation. It simply floods, recedes, and quietly reminds everyone that arguing with nature is generally a poor career move. If you live in ancient Egypt, your entire year revolves around this remarkable river. Every summer, heavy rains falling hundreds of miles away in the Ethiopian highlands cause the Nile to swell. Weeks later, those waters arrive in Egypt, spilling over the riverbanks and covering the surrounding fields with rich black silt. To modern eyes, it might look like a natural disaster. To you, it's the reason your family eats next year. Without these floods, Egypt would mostly be desert. The ancient Egyptians even had a saying that Egypt was the gift of the Nile. It wasn't an exaggeration. Nearly every village, farm, and city depended on this annual cycle. The river provided drinking water, fish, transportation, fertile farmland, clay for bricks, reeds for baskets and boats, and endless opportunities for crocodiles to remind everyone that swimming required careful planning. Because the Nile followed a predictable rhythm, so did your work. The Egyptian year was divided into 3 seasons, each lasting about 4 months. The first season was Akhet, the season of inundation, when the floodwaters spread across the fields. Next came Pere, the season when the water retreated and farmers planted crops into the fresh, nutrient-rich soil. Finally came Shemu, the harvest season, when grain had to be gathered before the scorching heat arrived. Every occupation adjusted to these seasons. If you're a farmer, your busiest months aren't determined by a manager staring at spreadsheets. They're determined by whether your fields are underwater or dry enough to plant. During the flood season, ploughing is impossible because your wheat field has temporarily become part of the Nile. Surprisingly, oxen are not enthusiastic about underwater farming. Instead, this quieter period often allows you to repair tools, strengthen canals, help with community building projects, or work for the state on temples and monuments. If you're a fisherman, however, life barely slows down at all. The river is your office, and business remains open. The fish, unfortunately, never seem to recognize public holidays. Scribes remain busy recording harvest estimates, collecting taxes, tracking supplies, and writing official documents. Bureaucracy, it turns out, has always been one of humanity's most durable inventions. As you settle into this rhythm, one thing becomes clear. Ancient Egyptians didn't organize life around the clock. They organized it around the river. And unlike your phone's calendar, the Nile almost never forgot what day it was. The flood has arrived. A few weeks ago, you were walking through neat rows of farmland, checking your tools and wondering whether this year's harvest would be generous. Today, you're standing at the edge of what looks suspiciously like a very large lake where your fields used to be. Oddly enough, this is excellent news. If you're an ancient Egyptian farmer, the annual inundation isn't a catastrophe. It's the beginning of the most important season of the year. The muddy water slowly spreads across the floodplain, leaving behind a fresh layer of fertile black silt. Without it, the soil would soon become exhausted, harvests would shrink, and dinner would become considerably less interesting. But while the flood nourishes the land, it also creates one unavoidable problem. You can't farm underwater. You can stare at your submerged field as long as you like. The wheat will not politely begin growing beneath 3 feet of water, simply because you're feeling optimistic. Ancient Egyptians respected nature, largely because nature had an excellent record of winning every argument. For the next several weeks, your usual farming routine simply stops. Now, that doesn't mean everyone spends months reclining beneath palm trees while servants peel grapes. Despite what some Roman writers later implied about luxury, most Egyptians remained busy. The difference was that they became busy doing different things. This was often the season for repairing houses damaged during the previous year. Mud brick walls needed fresh plaster. Roofs required maintenance. Granaries were inspected. Irrigation canals were cleaned and strengthened before the water retreated. Boats were repaired, tools sharpened, baskets woven, and fishing nets patched. Think of it as the world's largest home improvement season, except there isn't a hardware store, and forgetting one tool might mean walking several miles to borrow it from your cousin. The flood season also allowed the state to gather large numbers of workers for public projects. This is where the pyramids enter the story. Contrary to old myths, many historians believe that a significant portion of the labour force working on royal monuments consisted of farmers who were temporarily free because their own fields were underwater. Instead of sitting idle, they contributed labour to projects sponsored by the pharaoh, receiving food, clothing, housing, and often beer as payment. Being paid partly in beer sounds unusual today. Then again, modern companies occasionally reward employees with branded coffee mugs, so perhaps history hasn't changed quite as much as we'd like. Beer in ancient Egypt wasn't simply a luxury. It was nutritious, safer than questionable water sources, and a normal part of the daily diet for adults and children alike. Receiving beer as part of your wages wasn't a bonus, it was practical. The flood season also gave families something increasingly rare in the modern world. Time. Time to repair relationships, visit neighbouring villages, prepare for upcoming festivals, teach children practical skills, and simply live at a pace dictated by nature instead of deadlines. Life certainly wasn't effortless, but it wasn't an endless sprint either. Ironically, the busiest river in Egypt created one of the quietest seasons for the people who depended on it most. Just as you begin settling into the rhythm of the Nile, you discover something else that shaped your work schedule. The gods apparently enjoyed a good celebration. A very good celebration. Ancient Egypt wasn't home to just 1 or 2 major religious holidays. Depending on where you lived and which period of history you happened to occupy, the calendar was packed with festivals honouring dozens of different gods and goddesses. Some lasted a single day. Others stretched on for several days, filling temples, streets, and riverbanks with music, feasts, processions, and enough incense to make the entire city smell like an expensive candle shop. For you, these weren't optional weekend activities. Religion was woven into every part of daily life. The gods controlled the flood, the harvest, the sun, the afterlife, and just about everything else that mattered. If a festival honoured one of them, the community paid attention. That often meant work slowed down or stopped entirely. Imagine you're a carpenter halfway through building a new boat. Today you plan to finish the hull. Instead, your neighbour knocks on the door before sunrise. The procession starts in an hour. Well, the boat can wait. Throughout Egypt, temple priests carried sacred statues of the gods through the streets, usually hidden inside beautifully decorated shrines resting on ceremonial barges, or carried on poles by teams of priests. Most ordinary people never saw the statue itself, but they gathered along the roads to watch the procession pass, believing they were sharing a moment with the divine. The atmosphere was nothing like the silent temples many people imagine today. Musicians played harps, flutes, drums, and rattles called sistrums. Singers performed hymns while dancers entertained the crowds. Families wore clean linen clothing, children ran through busy streets, merchants sold food and drink, and neighbours who rarely had time to visit each other suddenly spent the entire day together. It was equal parts religious ceremony, community gathering, and neighbourhood party. Honestly, if your modern office celebrated quarterly reports with free bread, music, and beer instead of PowerPoint presentations, attendance might improve considerably. One of the grandest celebrations was the Opet festival in Thebes. During this festival, the statues of Amun, Mut, and Khonsu travelled from Karnak Temple to Luxor Temple in magnificent processions. Thousands of people lined the route. Food was distributed, offerings were made, and the celebration reinforced both the power of the gods and the authority of the pharaoh. For ordinary Egyptians, it was also a welcome break from routine. The same was true of many local festivals dedicated to village gods. Not every celebration reached the scale of Opet, but almost every community had occasions that brought work to a temporary halt. This wasn't laziness. It was considered essential. Maintaining harmony between humans and the gods, what Egyptians called ma'at, was believed to keep the entire universe functioning properly. Good harvests, peaceful communities, and stable government all depended upon preserving that balance. So if someone questioned why work had paused for another religious celebration, the answer was quite simple. Because a healthy universe seemed slightly more important than finishing the fence before lunchtime, and remarkably, the civilization managed to last for over 3,000 years with that philosophy. By now, you've probably noticed a pattern. Every time you start thinking ancient Egypt must have been one endless cycle of work, another festival appears, another religious procession winds through the streets, or another season changes your entire routine. If you were keeping track of your workdays on a modern calendar, you'd probably need an extra colour just for holidays. And there were plenty of them. Historians estimate that throughout the year, Egyptians observed dozens of religious festivals. Depending on the period and the city where you lived, there could be around 60 to more than 100 festival days annually. Some were celebrated across the kingdom, while others belonged to local temples or particular gods worshipped only in certain regions. That doesn't mean everyone spent 1/3 of the year doing absolutely nothing. Life still had to continue. Animals still needed feeding. Bread still had to be baked. Someone still had to remember where the goats had wandered off to. Goats, much like toddlers, seemed naturally gifted at appearing exactly where they weren't supposed to be. But compared to modern work schedules, these holidays genuinely interrupted ordinary life. Take a typical village. Normally, the streets are filled with people carrying grain, repairing fishing nets, shaping pottery, or hauling water from the river. Then a festival arrives, and everything changes. Homes are cleaned, fresh linen comes out of storage, musicians gather in public squares, and families prepare special meals they may have been looking forward to for weeks. The temples become the center of attention. Priests perform rituals from dawn until nightfall, burning incense and presenting offerings of bread, fruit, vegetables, flowers, meat, beer, and wine before the statues of the gods. While much of the ceremony remains inside the temple itself, the celebrations often spread into the surrounding streets, where ordinary Egyptians could join in feasting and entertainment. The smell alone would have been unforgettable. Fresh bread baking in clay ovens, roasted duck and goose turning over open fires, sweet dates and figs piled high in woven baskets, beer flowing almost as reliably as the Nile itself. Frankly, If your office holiday party involved roasted goose instead of slightly stale sandwiches, morale surveys would probably improve overnight. These celebrations weren't simply excuses to enjoy good food. They reinforced community. Neighbours who spent weeks working separate fields now gathered together. Families visited relatives in nearby villages. Children played games while older generations exchanged stories, news and gossip that had accumulated since the previous festival. And there was always gossip. Human civilization has successfully reinvented countless technologies over the millennia. It has never managed to eliminate gossip. Even the pharaoh understood the importance of festivals. Royal donations often helped pay for enormous public feasts. Grain, meat and beer could be distributed to large crowds, reinforcing the image of the king as both protector and provider. A well-fed population was generally a happier population, a lesson governments have been rediscovering ever since. As you stand among the crowds, watching musicians play beneath colourful temple banners while the aroma of fresh bread fills the warm Egyptian air, it's difficult not to notice something. These people worked hard, but they also believed that stopping work together, celebrating together, and enjoying life together wasn't a distraction from society. It was one of the reasons society held together in the first place. At some point, you begin to notice something strange. You've spent several chapters living in ancient Egypt, following the seasons, attending festivals, and enjoying the occasional unexpected break from farming. Yet we still haven't really talked about the pyramids. That's because, despite dominating every documentary ever made about Egypt, they occupied only a tiny fraction of most Egyptians' lives. Still, eventually curiosity gets the better of you. What if you volunteered to work on one? The first surprise arrives almost immediately. Nobody is chasing you across the desert with a whip. For generations, people believed the pyramids were built almost entirely by enslaved workers, forced into endless labour under brutal conditions. It made for dramatic movies, but archaeology has painted a very different picture. The workers who built the Great Pyramids at Giza were largely skilled labourers, craftsmen, and seasonal workers recruited from across Egypt. Many were farmers whose own fields lay beneath the Nile's floodwaters, leaving them temporarily available for state projects. Rather than wasting those months waiting for the river to retreat, they earned food, clothing, shelter, and wages by helping construct monuments for the pharaoh. It's less chains and misery, and more temporary government contract. Admittedly, the commute was considerably worse. As you arrive at the workers' settlement, you're surprised again. This isn't a chaotic camp of exhausted labourers sleeping in the sand. Rows of carefully planned houses stand nearby. Bakers prepare fresh bread. Brewers produce enormous quantities of beer. Kitchens serve meals every day, while physicians treat injuries and illnesses. Archaeologists have even discovered evidence that workers with broken bones received medical care and enough recovery time for those bones to heal properly before returning to work. Your employer may send you an email saying, "Feel better soon." The pyramid builders occasionally received actual health care. Lunch is far better than you expected. Workers consumed large amounts of bread and beer, but also onions, garlic, fish, vegetables, and surprisingly generous portions of beef, mutton, and goat. Feeding thousands of labourers required an enormous logistical operation. Herds of cattle arrived regularly, while grain shipments flowed constantly into the settlement. Building a pyramid burned an astonishing number of calories. Thankfully, so did carrying the groceries. Of course, this doesn't mean the work was easy. Far from it. Moving multi-ton limestone blocks required incredible teamwork, carefully organised crews, sledges pulled across lubricated paths, ropes, wooden levers, and years of experience. Skilled stonecutters shaped blocks with remarkable precision using copper tools and stone hammers. Surveyors measured every angle with astonishing accuracy, long before lasers or computer software existed. One mistake could affect hundreds of stones. No pressure. Interestingly, workers even gave their crews humorous names. Archaeologists have uncovered references to groups called things like the Friends of Khufu or the Drunkards of Menkaure. Apparently, giving construction teams slightly ridiculous names is another tradition humanity never abandoned. Standing before the rising pyramid, covered in dust and sweat, you realize something important. These people certainly worked incredibly hard, but they weren't anonymous slaves toiling without purpose. They were organized professionals, contributing to one of history's greatest construction projects, and when their shift ended, many of them went home, shared dinner with their families, drank a few jars of beer, and prepared to do it all again tomorrow. When your time at the pyramid construction site comes to an end, you decide to visit another remarkable community. This time, you're heading south to a village unlike any other in ancient Egypt. Welcome to Deir el-Medina. Hidden against the desert cliffs near Thebes, this small settlement was home to the highly skilled craftsmen responsible for decorating and constructing the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings. If the pyramid builders were the engineers of Egypt's greatest monuments, these men were the artists who ensured pharaohs entered eternity in style. After all, if you're going to spend forever in the afterlife, you might as well have nicely painted walls. The village itself is surprisingly orderly. Around 70 tightly packed mud brick houses line narrow streets. Every family knows every other family. Privacy is limited. If you burn tonight's bread, there's an excellent chance 3 neighbours will know before breakfast tomorrow. As you settle into your new routine, something stands out immediately. Your work schedule looks surprisingly civilized. Instead of labouring every single day, the craftsmen generally worked an 8-day cycle, followed by 2 days of rest. Those days off were valuable. You could repair your home, visit relatives, attend religious ceremonies, hunt in the nearby desert, or simply recover from the physically demanding work inside the royal tombs. Modern weekends suddenly seem slightly less revolutionary. Your working day begins early. You and your fellow craftsmen leave the village together, walking across the rocky desert toward the Valley of the Kings. The journey itself takes time, and once inside the tomb, everyone has a specialized role. Stonecutters smooth the walls, plasterers prepare fresh surfaces, artists sketch outlines using red pigment, master painters refine every figure, scribes carefully copy sacred texts that will guide the pharaoh through the afterlife. No one works alone. Building a royal tomb requires extraordinary teamwork, and many of these craftsmen spend decades perfecting their particular skills. Some families produce generations of artists, with sons learning directly from fathers who learned from grandfathers before them. You quickly realize this is less like temporary construction work and more like belonging to an elite guild. The government values your expertise. Workers receive regular rations of grain, beer, vegetables, fish, oil, and clothing instead of traditional wages. Records even show that when these deliveries arrived late, the craftsmen were not afraid to complain. In fact, they became famous for something historians still talk about today. One day, after repeated delays in receiving their food rations, the workers simply stopped working. They walked off the job, rather politely by ancient standards. This event, which took place during the reign of Ramesses III, is considered the first recorded labour strike in human history. Imagine explaining that to your supervisor. I'm participating in a 3,000-year-old workplace tradition. As evening approaches, you return home beneath the fading Egyptian sun. Children play in the streets while neighbours prepare supper. Conversations drift from one rooftop to another, mixing stories about work, family, temple festivals, and whatever amusing mistake someone made inside the tomb that day. Life here isn't luxurious. The houses are modest, the desert is harsh, and the work demands incredible precision. But it's also a stable community with regular rest days, skilled professions, organised labour, and workers confident enough to demand fair treatment when promises weren't kept. For a civilization over 3,000 years old, that's unexpectedly familiar. By now, you've met pyramid builders, tomb painters, and enough priests to suspect that ancient Egypt may have had more religious festivals than actual weekdays. But what about everyone else? After all, not every Egyptian spent life decorating royal tombs or hauling limestone. In fact, the overwhelming majority of people simply tried to earn a living, raise a family, and avoid making the tax collector noticeably interested in their existence. So today, you get to try 3 different careers. Let's begin as a farmer. Before sunrise, you're already awake. The air is cool. The Nile reflects the first light of dawn, and your ox is staring at you with the unmistakable expression of an employee who has absolutely no intention of helping until breakfast. Your responsibilities are endless. You plough fields, sow grain, repair irrigation ditches, weed crops, tend livestock, harvest wheat, and store grain safely before pests or moisture destroy months of work. When harvest arrives, life becomes exhausting. Every hour matters because waiting too long could ruin the crop. Entire families join together in the fields. Even children help with lighter tasks, learning from an early age that bread begins long before the bakery. Then the season changes. The flood arrives, your fields disappear beneath water, and suddenly your schedule becomes far less demanding. You still repair tools, maintain your home, or assist with public projects, but the frantic pace eases considerably. Now let's try becoming a craftsman. Instead of fields, your world smells of wood shavings, wet clay, molten copper, or freshly cut stone. Perhaps you're shaping elegant pottery. Perhaps you're weaving linen so fine that wealthy nobles proudly wear it to temple ceremonies. Or maybe you're building furniture for someone whose chair somehow requires more decoration than your entire house. Craftsmen usually enjoy steadier work throughout the year than farmers. Cities always need tools, baskets, sandals, jewelry, boats, statues, and household goods. Your income depends largely on your skill. The better your craftsmanship, the more valuable your work becomes. Of course, perfection takes time. One cracked vase can erase several days of effort. No pressure there. Finally, you become a scribe. Congratulations. After several days of working in the Egyptian sun, you've discovered one unavoidable truth. No one can function on an empty stomach. Fortunately, ancient Egyptians took food very seriously. Not in the modern sense of photographing every meal before eating it. Thankfully, no one is delaying lunch because the bread needs better lighting. Instead, food is simply fuel, essential for surviving long hours of physical labour beneath a blazing African sun. Your day usually begins early with a simple breakfast, a loaf of coarse bread, perhaps accompanied by onions, dates, figs, or leftover vegetables from the previous evening. If you're fortunate, there may be cheese or a little fish. Nothing extravagant, but enough to get you through the cool morning hours before the heat becomes relentless. Then comes work. Whether you're harvesting grain, shaping stone, or recording tax accounts, the Egyptian sun steadily climbs higher. By midday, the temperature can become oppressive. The light is so intense that even the stray village dogs seem to have collectively agreed that productivity is overrated until evening. So you stop. Not because you're lazy, because continuing at full speed under the hottest part of the day would be both miserable and remarkably foolish. Many workers slowed their pace or took breaks during the afternoon heat whenever their duties allowed. Shade became one of the most valuable resources in Egypt. A tree, a mud brick wall, or a simple woven shelter could feel like a gift from the gods themselves. You find a cool spot beside your fellow workers. Lunch is already waiting. Fresh bread appears once again, because in ancient Egypt, bread is less of a food and more of a lifestyle. Alongside it come onions, garlic, lentils, beans, cucumbers, and perhaps salted fish, or a piece of roasted duck if you're celebrating something special. Then someone passes you a large pottery jar. Beer. Not the crystal clear beer you might imagine today. Egyptian beer is thick, cloudy, slightly grainy, and filling enough that you could almost chew parts of it. It contains relatively little alcohol by modern standards, but provides calories, nutrients, and hydration. For many workers, beer is consumed every single day. Children drink weaker versions. Adults drink stronger ones. Somewhere, a modern human resources department is collectively hyperventilating. Beer even forms part of many workers' wages. Records from construction sites show labourers receiving measured daily rations of bread and beer. carefully calculated according to their role and responsibilities. To an Egyptian worker, getting paid in beer isn't unusual. It's payroll. Of course, meals are about more than simply eating. This is when conversations happen. Workers exchange news from neighbouring villages, debate whether this year's flood will be generous, complain about stubborn donkeys, laugh about someone's failed attempt to catch a goose, or speculate about what the pharaoh might be building next. Remarkably, workplace gossip appears to be one of humanity's oldest surviving traditions. As the worst of the afternoon heat begins to fade, everyone gradually returns to work. The pace quickens again. Tools strike stone. Farmers return to their fields. Boats move along the Nile. The village comes alive once more. Watching this daily rhythm unfold, you realize something modern life often forgets. Ancient Egyptians weren't trying to squeeze every possible minute out of every day. They understood that people worked best when they respected the climate instead of trying to defeat it. Considering the sun above your head feels determined to melt both you and your sandals, it seems like a very sensible policy indeed. You've now spent enough time in ancient Egypt to notice something rather unexpected. People don't always show up for work. Shocking, isn't it? For a civilization famous for discipline, monumental architecture, and astonishing organization, the Egyptians also left behind something wonderfully human: attendance records. And these records reveal that workers were, in many ways, exactly like us. Only their excuses were considerably more entertaining. The best evidence comes once again from Deir el-Medina, the village of royal tomb builders. The scribes carefully recorded who came to work each day, and more importantly, who didn't. If you failed to appear one morning, someone writes your name down. No disappearing quietly, no pretending nobody noticed. 3,000 years before digital attendance systems, there was already someone keeping track. The reasons for missing work are surprisingly familiar. You're sick, your wife is ill, your child has a fever, you hurt your foot, you were bitten by a scorpion. Fair enough. Scorpions generally make for a convincing excuse. Other absences are a little more creative. Perhaps you're attending the funeral of a relative. Perhaps you're making offerings to a family god. Perhaps you're helping repair your house after part of the roof collapsed. Mud brick homes were sturdy, but they occasionally reminded their owners that maintenance was not optional. Then there are the wonderfully ordinary reasons. One record simply notes that a worker stayed home because he was brewing beer. Imagine emailing your manager. "Sorry, can't come in today. Busy making beer." Oddly enough, in ancient Egypt, that might actually be accepted. Another worker is absent because his donkey wandered off. Considering donkeys were essential for transporting goods, losing one was rather like discovering your delivery truck had decided to begin a new life several villages away. Someone else misses work while caring for his mother. Another because of eye pain. Another because he was mourning the death of a family member. These records paint a surprisingly compassionate picture. Life happened, and employers generally understood that. That doesn't mean workers could disappear whenever they pleased. The government still expected major projects to continue, especially royal tombs. Scribes monitored attendance carefully, and repeated unexplained absences certainly attracted attention. Even in ancient Egypt, there was probably one co-worker who mysteriously developed an illness every time heavy lifting was scheduled. Human nature, it seems, has enjoyed remarkable stability. Healthcare itself was also more advanced than many people imagine. Egyptian physicians treated broken bones, stitched wounds, prescribed herbal remedies, and diagnosed illnesses using surprisingly detailed medical knowledge for the time. Workers injured on major state projects often received treatment rather than simply being replaced. Medicine wasn't magical, but it wasn't primitive either. As you recover from your own sore muscles after weeks of labour, you begin to appreciate something else about Egyptian society. Its workers weren't viewed as endlessly replaceable machines. They were valuable people with families, illnesses, responsibilities, and lives beyond their jobs. For all its kings and monuments, ancient Egypt still depended on ordinary individuals showing up each morning, and occasionally not showing up at all. Apparently, calling in sick has a much longer history than anyone expected. If the flood season was ancient Egypt's opportunity to catch its breath, harvest season was the moment everyone stopped relaxing. Immediately. The Nile has long since retreated, the grain has grown tall beneath the Egyptian sun, and now the fields stretch before you like waves of gold. It is a beautiful sight. It is also a countdown. Because once the grain is ready, waiting is no longer an option. You wake before dawn. The air is still cool, and workers are already gathering with sickles tucked into their belts. Families move toward the fields together. Men, women, older children, neighbours, and hired labourers all have jobs to do. Even the village dogs seem unusually motivated, although mostly because they hope someone drops lunch. Today, every pair of hands matters. The wheat and barley must be cut before birds eat too much of it, before unexpected weather damages it, or before the dry stalks become too brittle. Ancient Egypt rarely suffered heavy rain, but wind, pests, and simple bad timing could still reduce months of hard work. This is not the season for taking things slowly. Harvesting begins with rows of workers cutting stalks using curved wooden sickles fitted with razor-sharp flint blades. Behind them, others gather the bundles and tie them together before carrying them to large threshing floors. There, cattle or donkeys walk in endless circles over the grain, separating the edible kernels from the stalks. The animals probably don't enjoy the process. They also aren't consulted. Next comes winnowing. Workers throw the mixture into the air using wooden forks or baskets. The breeze carries away the lighter chaff, while the heavier grain falls back to the ground. It looks surprisingly elegant, almost like a carefully practiced dance, provided you ignore the fact that everyone is covered in dust and sweating through their linen clothes. By midday, you're exhausted, your back aches, your hands are blistered. There is straw in places you didn't know straw could reach, and somehow there are still several fields left. Suddenly, those quieter weeks during the flood season make perfect sense. The Egyptian calendar wasn't designed to avoid hard work. It balanced periods of intense labour with periods of recovery. Modern life often spreads moderate stress across the entire year. Ancient Egypt preferred concentrating enormous effort into a few crucial seasons. Then came the tax collectors. Just when you think the hardest part is over, government officials arrive to measure the harvest. Scribes carefully record how much grain every field has produced, calculating the share owed to the state. Nothing escapes their attention, not even that suspiciously small grain pile you've been hoping nobody would compare with your unusually large field. Apparently, tax audits are another invention with ancient roots. Once the grain is safely stored inside massive granaries, however, an enormous weight lifts from the entire community. The food supply for the coming year is secure. Families celebrate. Workers finally slow their pace. Children return to playing instead of carrying baskets. For a few precious weeks, everyone can breathe again. You've just survived the busiest season in ancient Egypt, and unlike your overflowing email inbox, this workload actually comes to an end. At last, the harvest is finished. The granaries are full, the taxes have been paid, your tools are cleaned and stored away, and for the first time in weeks, you wake up without immediately wondering which field needs your attention. It feels strange. Not because you're bored, because you've remembered that life isn't only about work. Ancient Egyptians certainly laboured hard when the seasons demanded it, but they also understood something surprisingly modern. People need time to enjoy themselves. As the afternoon sun softens, you wander into the village square. Children are everywhere. Some wrestle in the dust, while others throw small balls made from stitched leather and stuffed reeds. A few play with carved wooden animals pulled along by strings, while others invent games whose rules appear to change every 5 minutes depending on who is currently winning. Humanity also invented making up the rules as you go. Parents have been sighing ever since. Nearby, a group of older villagers has gathered around a beautifully carved game board. They're playing Senet, Egypt's most famous board game. The rules remain partly mysterious today, but to the Egyptians, it was far more than simple entertainment. The game symbolized the soul's journey through the afterlife, blending strategy, luck, and religious belief into something people could enjoy after supper. Imagine if every family Monopoly game also doubled as spiritual preparation for eternity. The arguments would somehow become even more intense. Music fills the air. A young woman plucks the strings of a harp, while another plays a flute carved from reed. Someone keeps rhythm with hand drums, while dancers clap and move gracefully through the gathering crowd. Children copy the adults with varying degrees of success, usually ending with someone tripping over a goat. The goat appears deeply unimpressed. Music is everywhere in Egypt. You hear it during festivals, weddings, religious ceremonies, family celebrations, and ordinary evenings like this one. Professional musicians perform for wealthy households, but every village has people who sing, clap, dance, and play simple instruments together. Entertainment doesn't require a ticket, it simply requires neighbours. As evening approaches, families gather on rooftops where the cooler breeze offers relief from the day's heat. Stories begin to flow. Grandparents tell tales of clever gods, foolish kings, dangerous spirits, heroic ancestors, and animals that somehow always manage to outsmart humans. Some stories teach lessons, others exist purely because they're amusing. Fortunately, history has always made room for both. You notice something else. Nobody seems to be in a hurry. Conversations continue without someone constantly checking the time. Neighbours linger after dinner. Friends laugh over another jar of beer, while children slowly fall asleep beside their parents under skies filled with brilliant stars unspoiled by city lights. For most Egyptians, these simple moments were every bit as important as the hours spent working in the fields. A civilization isn't built only by labour. It's also built by shared meals, music, games, friendships, and evenings when the day's work is finally finished. Looking around the village, you begin to understand why ancient Egypt endured for thousands of years. Its people didn't simply know how to work. They also remembered how to live. After spending an entire year in ancient Egypt, something begins to feel unusual. Not here. About home. You think back to your modern life, where every weekday looks almost identical. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, they blur together in a cycle of alarms, commutes, meetings, deadlines, and somehow receiving an email marked urgent at 4:58 on a Friday afternoon. The ancient Egyptians would probably have several questions. Most of them would begin with, why? Their lives certainly weren't easier. Life expectancy was shorter. Medicine was limited. Childbirth was dangerous. A poor harvest could threaten an entire community, and a single illness could change a family's future forever. Yet despite all those hardships, their relationship with work was fundamentally different. Work existed to support life. It wasn't expected to become life itself. Everything revolved around natural rhythms. When the Nile flooded, farming paused. When harvest arrived, everyone worked intensely. When festivals came, communities celebrated together. When the sun became unbearably hot, people slowed down whenever they could. Nature decided the schedule. Today, we often try to make the schedule ignore nature completely. Offices stay open whether it's snowing, raining, or 40 degrees outside. Supermarkets operate late into the night. Emails travel across continents in seconds. Someone, somewhere, is always working. The sun could explode tomorrow morning, and there would probably still be an online meeting scheduled for 9. Ancient Egyptians also understood something modern society sometimes struggles to accept. Rest had value. Not because resting increased productivity, because people needed it. Religious festivals weren't viewed as interruptions to work. They were part of the proper order of society. Family meals weren't squeezed into tiny gaps between appointments. They were daily rituals. Evenings belonged largely to conversation, storytelling, music, and community, because darkness naturally brought the working day to an end. There was no temptation to answer, just one more message. There wasn't even one more message. Perhaps the biggest difference lies in how success was measured. Today, people often ask what you do. In ancient Egypt, they were more concerned with whether your household was thriving, whether your family had enough grain stored for the coming year, whether your neighbours trusted you, and whether you lived according to Ma'at, the principle of balance, justice, and harmony that guided Egyptian society. Working harder simply for the sake of working harder would have seemed rather odd. Working well was what mattered. Of course, we shouldn't romanticize the past. Ancient Egyptians faced exhausting labor, heavy taxes, political instability, and years when the Nile flooded too much, or not enough at all. Their world could be brutally unforgiving, but perhaps they understood one timeless lesson. Life moves in seasons. Some seasons demand everything you have. Others allow you to recover, celebrate, and simply exist without feeling guilty for not being constantly productive. Looking back across more than 3,000 years, you begin to wonder whether the Egyptians were ahead of their time, or whether, somewhere along the way, we simply forgot that even the mighty Nile knew when it was time to slow down. As the sun sets over the Nile one last time, you find yourself asking the question that brought you here in the first place. Did ancient Egyptians really work less than you? The answer, perhaps frustratingly, is both yes and no. If you simply count the number of days spent working, many ordinary Egyptians probably did enjoy more breaks throughout the year than the average modern employee. Religious festivals regularly interrupted daily life. The annual flood paused farming for weeks. Seasonal work naturally created periods of intense labour, followed by quieter months. There was no expectation that every single day had to be equally productive. In that sense, your calendar in ancient Egypt might actually feel refreshing. But there's another side to the story. When work was necessary, it was genuinely hard. Harvest season demanded exhausting physical effort from sunrise until sunset. Farmers worked with simple hand tools, often barefoot beneath the blazing Egyptian sun. Craftsmen spent years mastering difficult skills. Quarry workers cut stone in suffocating heat. Boatmen fought strong currents, while labourers carried loads that would make most modern gym memberships seem slightly unnecessary. There were no tractors, no electric saws, no forklifts, and certainly no air conditioning. The closest thing to climate control was standing under the only tree for half a mile and hoping nobody else reached it first. Life itself was also far less comfortable. A toothache could become life-threatening. A broken leg might permanently change your future. Infant mortality was tragically common, and diseases we easily treat today could spread through entire communities. One poor Nile flood could mean hunger for thousands of families. Modern life has many frustrations. Ancient life had considerably fewer passwords, but significantly more parasites. Yet despite these hardships, there is something deeply appealing about the Egyptian rhythm of life. Their society accepted that human beings couldn't maintain the same pace every day of the year. Nature demanded flexibility, and people adapted accordingly. There was time to celebrate, to mourn, to gather with family, to honour the gods, to repair homes, to share meals, and occasionally to do absolutely nothing while waiting for the river to finish flooding. No one felt guilty because the fields were underwater. There was literally nothing else the fields could do. Perhaps that's the greatest lesson ancient Egypt leaves behind. Productivity wasn't measured hour by hour. It was measured harvest by harvest, generation by generation. The goal wasn't to squeeze every possible minute out of life. The goal was to create balance, to work when work was needed, to rest when rest was possible, to celebrate when there was something worth celebrating. And somehow, following that rhythm, ordinary people built one of the longest-lasting civilizations in human history. So, were ancient Egyptians better off than you? Probably not. Medicine, technology, and modern comforts have transformed our lives beyond anything they could have imagined. But if an Egyptian farmer could somehow visit today, watch us answer emails during dinner, check our phones before going to sleep, and apologize for taking a vacation, he might quietly look toward the nearest river and wonder whether, despite all our incredible inventions, we've accidentally made life far more complicated than it needed to be. Long before the first scoop of vanilla landed in a cone, before frozen yogurt became fashionable, and before someone decided that mint belonged anywhere near chocolate, humanity had already fallen hopelessly in love with frozen desserts. Thousands of years before the invention of ice cream, powerful kings, ambitious emperors, and ingenious cooks were risking enormous efforts simply to enjoy one magical sensation: the taste of cold on a scorching summer day. That may sound surprisingly modern, but the craving itself is ancient. Imagine standing beneath the blazing summer sun in the heart of ancient Persia. The air shimmers above stone roads. Dust clings to your sandals. Every breath feels warm enough to bake bread. Water left in the open quickly becomes lukewarm, and shade is more valuable than gold. On a day like this, the idea of eating something frozen would seem about as realistic as ordering a pizza by messenger pigeon. Yet somehow, it happened. The secret began far away from the cities, high in the mountains where snow lingered long after spring had vanished below. Long caravans of labourers climbed steep slopes carrying baskets, leather sacks, and thick blankets of straw. Their mission was simple to explain, but exhausting to perform: gather fresh snow and bring it back before the sun claimed it. You can picture the frustration. Every hour of travel meant watching part of your precious cargo quietly melt away. It was perhaps the only delivery service in history where your product literally disappeared while you were transporting it. But the reward justified the effort. For rulers and wealthy nobles, snow was not merely frozen water. It was proof that nature itself could be conquered. If you could summon winter in the middle of summer, you demonstrated power over both distance and season. Serving chilled delicacies at a royal banquet wasn't simply hospitality, it was a statement. It told every guest that your wealth reached mountains they would never climb, and commanded workers they would never meet. Of course, hauling snow downhill was only half the challenge. Keeping it frozen once it reached the cities required remarkable engineering. Ancient Persian builders constructed enormous underground chambers known today as yakhchals. These towering mud brick domes concealed deep storage pits insulated so well that ice collected during winter could survive well into the hottest months. Some even used clever wind-catching towers and underground channels that naturally cooled the interior without any machinery. Inside these remarkable structures, cooks suddenly had possibilities that seemed almost magical. Fresh mountain snow could be mixed with fragrant rosewater, sweet grape syrup, crushed fruits, or honey harvested from wild hives. Instead of heavy cakes or baked pastries, guests received delicate bowls of flavoured snow that melted gently on the tongue. The experience lasted only moments before disappearing completely, making every bite feel even more precious. You weren't simply eating dessert, you were tasting the impossible. And although these frozen treats looked very different from the ice cream-filling supermarket freezers today, they marked the beginning of a culinary adventure that would travel across empires, inspire generations of inventive cooks, and eventually transform one of humanity's oldest dreams into one of its favourite indulgences. The journey toward ice cream had quietly begun, one basket of mountain snow at a time. If hauling snow from the mountains sounds extravagant, the Persians had an even more impressive idea. They didn't stop at eating flavoured snow. They transformed it into one of the world's first recognisable frozen desserts, a luxurious creation that historians consider one of ice cream's oldest ancestors. Its name was falude. Remarkably, you can still order it in parts of Iran today, making it one of the oldest continuously enjoyed desserts on Earth. Unlike the simple mixtures of snow and honey served elsewhere, falude was carefully crafted. Thin noodles made from starch were chilled until icy, then mixed with snow or crushed ice, and drenched in fragrant rosewater syrup. Lime juice sometimes added a bright, refreshing sharpness, while pistachios or sour cherry syrup could provide extra flavour. The result was sweet but not overpowering, floral without being perfumed, and astonishingly refreshing during the brutal Persian summer. It probably wasn't creamy like modern ice cream. There was no milk or cream involved. Instead, imagine something halfway between a frozen sorbet and a delicate bowl of icy noodles. It may sound unusual today, but so does putting pineapple on pizza, and somehow civilization survived that debate. Creating falude required more than talented cooks. It demanded remarkable engineering. The enormous yakchols introduced in the previous chapter became the beating heart of this frozen revolution. Some stood over 60 feet tall, their thick mud brick walls insulating deep underground chambers, where ice remained frozen even when temperatures outside climbed well above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. During winter, workers collected natural ice or froze water inside shallow canals during cold desert nights. Huge blocks were then carried into the storage chambers, stacked carefully and covered with insulating layers of straw. Throughout the following summer, royal kitchens could withdraw ice whenever they needed it, almost as if they had invented refrigeration 2,000 years ahead of schedule. Of course, this luxury belonged almost exclusively to the elite. Ordinary farmers rarely enjoyed frozen treats. Most spent their summers worrying about irrigation, harvests, and keeping livestock alive, rather than debating whether their dessert needed more rosewater. Frozen sweets became symbols of privilege, served during royal banquets, religious festivals, and celebrations that showcased the wealth and sophistication of the Persian court. Foreign travellers who encountered these chilled delicacies often described them with amazement. To visitors from hotter regions without access to such engineering, the experience bordered on magical. Imagine arriving after weeks crossing dusty deserts, only to be handed a bowl filled with something cold enough to produce visible frost. That feeling of astonishment would not remain confined to Persia for long. Merchants travelling the great trade routes carried more than silk, spices, and precious stones. They also carried ideas. Among the most delicious of those ideas was the possibility that frozen desserts could become an art form. inspiring neighbouring civilizations to experiment with snow, fruit, honey, and ice in ways the Persians themselves could scarcely have imagined. As Persian ideas spread beyond their borders, they eventually reached one man who rarely ignored anything worth taking. His name was Alexander. When Alexander the Great marched east in the 4th century before Christ, his armies conquered cities, kingdoms, and one of the largest empires the ancient world had ever seen. Along the way, they encountered Persian customs that fascinated the Macedonians. Some were grand, like magnificent palaces and royal ceremonies. Others were surprisingly simple, like the strange habit of serving snow flavoured with fruit juices and fragrant flowers. Alexander reportedly became quite fond of these chilled delicacies. Considering he spent years campaigning through some of the hottest landscapes imaginable, it is not difficult to understand why. After weeks of marching beneath an unforgiving sun, wearing heavy bronze armour and sleeping in dusty camps, a bowl of sweet snow probably felt less like dessert and more like a gift from the gods. His officers certainly weren't complaining either. The royal camp soon developed its own methods for obtaining snow. Whenever the army campaigned near mountain ranges, servants were dispatched to collect fresh snow and pack it into insulated containers lined with straw and cloth. Speed became everything. Riders hurried back before the precious cargo transformed into expensive drinking water. You certainly didn't want to be the messenger who arrived proudly announcing, "Good news, Your Majesty. I brought half a basket of very refreshing puddles." Alexander's enormous empire also created something even more valuable than military victories: connections. Roads that had once belonged to separate kingdoms now linked Greece, Egypt, Mesopotamia, Persia, and parts of Central Asia. Merchants, cooks, physicians, and travellers moved across these routes more freely than ever before, exchanging recipes alongside ideas about medicine, architecture, mathematics, and philosophy. Frozen desserts travelled with them. The Greeks already enjoyed sweet treats made from honey, figs, nuts, and fresh cheese, but Persian techniques introduced entirely new possibilities. Instead of simply eating fruit, people experimented with chilling it. Honey syrups were poured over snow. Wine was cooled before serving. Fresh berries became ingredients for luxurious refreshments reserved for festivals and aristocratic banquets. Greek physicians even debated whether eating snow was healthy. Some praised its cooling effects during intense summer heat, while others warned that excessive cold could upset the body's natural balance. Ancient doctors loved explaining everything through the balance of bodily humours. If you sneezed after eating too much snow, someone was almost certainly prepared to blame an excess of phlegm rather than the obvious fact that you had just swallowed a bowl of ice. Even so, the fascination only grew. By the time Alexander's empire fragmented after his death, the appetite for frozen delicacies had spread across the eastern Mediterranean. The recipe itself continued evolving as different cultures added their own ingredients, flavours, and techniques. Before long, another civilization, one famous for borrowing good ideas and claiming they had improved them, would embrace the frozen dessert with characteristic enthusiasm. That civilization was Rome. The Romans had an extraordinary talent for looking at someone else's clever invention and thinking, "That's excellent. We'll take it from here." Frozen desserts were no exception. By the time Rome dominated the Mediterranean, stories of Persia's chilled delicacies had already spread across the ancient world. Roman merchants, diplomats, and soldiers encountered these icy treats during their travels, and before long, the empire's wealthiest citizens wanted them at their own banquets. There was only one problem. Most of Italy enjoys warm summers, and Rome itself is hardly famous for year-round snow. Fortunately, the Romans had an empire large enough to solve almost any logistical challenge. Snow was gathered during winter from the Apennine Mountains, and in some cases, from the higher slopes of the Alps. Workers packed it tightly into pits lined with straw, leaves, and insulating earth. Wealthy villa owners even built underground ice houses where the precious snow could survive for months. The process demanded careful planning. Every layer of snow was compressed to remove air, covered with fresh insulation, then sealed away until summer. The deeper the pit, the longer the ice survived. Opening one of these storage chambers in July must have felt like discovering a tiny piece of January hidden beneath the earth. Naturally, the richest Romans enjoyed the best results. One emperor became especially famous for his love of snow. According to ancient writers, Emperor Nero ordered runners to race into the nearby mountains and return carrying fresh snow, even during the hottest days of summer. Once the snow reached the imperial kitchens, cooks mixed it with honey, fruit juices, and aromatic syrups made from ingredients such as violets, roses, or crushed berries. The finished dessert wasn't quite ice cream. It resembled a luxurious granita or sorbet, light, refreshing, and designed to melt almost instantly. The contrast between icy sweetness and Rome's suffocating summer heat made every spoonful unforgettable. Of course, Nero's reputation tends to overshadow everything else he did. Modern audiences usually remember stories about fires, extravagant palaces, and questionable decisions rather than his dessert preferences. Still, his passion for chilled treats illustrates how valuable snow had become in Roman society. It wasn't merely food, it was a display of power. Imagine hosting a lavish banquet where dozens of guests reclined on couches around polished tables. Servants carried roasted peacocks, fresh oysters, imported spices, and exotic wines. Then, just when everyone believed the meal had reached its peak, another servant appeared carrying bowls filled with sparkling snow flavoured with honey and ripe fruit. That final course sent a very clear message. I am wealthy enough to serve winter in the middle of August. For ordinary Romans, this spectacle remained almost unimaginable. Most citizens relied on bread, olives, vegetables, and whatever seasonal fruit they could afford. Frozen desserts belonged to emperors, senators, and the empire's richest families. Yet Rome's immense trade networks would soon make another important contribution. Beyond transporting snow, they carried sugar substitutes, fruits, spices, and culinary knowledge from Egypt, Syria, Greece, and beyond. As these ingredients flowed across the empire, frozen desserts became increasingly sophisticated, setting the stage for even more inventive chilled sweets in the centuries that followed. While Roman emperors were sending runners into the mountains for fresh snow, another civilization on the opposite side of Asia was conducting its own frozen experiments. China approached chilled desserts with the same philosophy it often applied to engineering, medicine, and cuisine. If something could be improved, someone would eventually find a way. The earliest records suggest that Chinese nobles had been enjoying cooled drinks and frozen delicacies for centuries. During the Zhou dynasty, royal officials were already responsible for collecting and storing ice harvested from frozen lakes and rivers during winter. Massive blocks were cut with bronze tools, hauled into specially constructed ice houses, and carefully buried beneath layers of straw and earth. This wasn't a side job. The royal court actually employed workers whose entire responsibility was managing ice supplies throughout the year. Imagine explaining your profession at a family gathering. So, what do you do? I guard frozen water. Not glamorous perhaps, but surprisingly important. By the time of the Tang dynasty, between the 7th and 10th centuries, Chinese cooks had begun experimenting with recipes that sound remarkably familiar today. Historical accounts describe chilled mixtures made from milk, often from water buffalo or goats, combined with flour and aromatic ingredients such as camphor. These mixtures were cooled using ice and salt, an ingenious technique that allowed temperatures to fall below the normal freezing point of water. That discovery was revolutionary. Simply placing food on ice only cools it. But mixing ice with salt creates a much colder environment, allowing liquids to freeze far more effectively. Modern homemade ice cream still relies on exactly the same scientific principle, although thankfully without requiring an imperial workforce or a frozen lake. The resulting desserts were probably unlike the creamy ice cream found today. Their texture was likely lighter, slightly grainier, and far less sweet, since refined sugar remained rare and expensive. Even so, they represented an extraordinary leap forward. Instead of merely flavouring snow, cooks were beginning to freeze prepared mixtures themselves. As always, these luxurious treats remained reserved for the elite. Members of the imperial family, high-ranking officials, and honoured guests enjoyed them during elaborate banquets, particularly during festivals when displaying rare delicacies reinforced the emperor's prestige. Serving something frozen in the height of summer demonstrated not only wealth but mastery over nature itself. Chinese culinary traditions also emphasized balance. Rather than overwhelming the palate with sweetness, frozen desserts often featured delicate floral aromas, subtle dairy flavors, or fruits that complemented the season. The goal was refreshment and harmony, not simply satisfying a sweet tooth. These innovations would quietly echo beyond China's borders. Merchants travelling the Silk Road carried spices, silk, porcelain, and ideas across thousands of miles. Along with those treasures travelled knowledge about preserving ice, cooling foods, and creating frozen delicacies. By now, civilizations stretching from the Mediterranean to East Asia had all reached the same remarkable conclusion. Winter, it turned out, could be served in a bowl. The only question remaining was how to make that miracle available to more than just kings and emperors. As the ancient world gave way to the medieval one, frozen desserts did not disappear. Instead, they found new life in the kitchens of the Islamic world, where brilliant cooks, merchants, and scholars refined recipes that had been evolving for thousands of years. If Persia had invented some of the earliest frozen treats, the great cities of the Islamic Golden Age helped perfect them. Baghdad, Damascus, Cairo, and later cities across Al-Andalus became centres of culinary innovation. Their markets overflowed with ingredients that earlier civilizations could only dream about. Fragrant lemons, oranges, pistachios, almonds, roses, violets, saffron, cinnamon, and perhaps most importantly of all, sugar. Unlike honey, which had dominated sweet recipes for centuries, sugar could produce cleaner, brighter flavours. As sugar cultivation spread across Persia, Egypt, and the Mediterranean under Islamic rule, desserts changed forever. Frozen desserts changed with them. Instead of simply mixing snow with fruit juice, cooks created elegant syrups flavoured with roses, orange blossoms, mint, mulberries, pomegranates, and fresh citrus. These concentrated syrups were poured over finely crushed ice to create refreshing delicacies known as sharbat, the ancestor of the modern word sherbet. The drink could be served almost icy enough to freeze your teeth, if medieval dentists had cared to comment on such things. Considering most dentistry at the time involved someone confidently removing the wrong tooth, they probably had bigger concerns. Producing enough ice remained the greatest challenge. Throughout Persia and much of the Middle East, enormous yakhchals continued storing winter ice well into summer. In mountain regions, fresh snow was transported by caravans. Wealthy households sometimes purchased blocks of ice from specialized merchants whose businesses depended entirely on preserving winter for as long as possible. Imagine being an ice merchant in the 9th century. Your entire livelihood depended on convincing the sun to lose. Surprisingly, they often succeeded. Some cities even organised regular deliveries of mountain snow to royal palaces, hospitals, and elite households. During important celebrations such as weddings or religious festivals, chilled drinks and frozen sweets became symbols of generosity and refinement. Serving guests an icy dessert in the middle of a scorching afternoon demonstrated not only wealth but sophistication. The scientific curiosity of the Islamic world also played an important role. Scholars carefully studied chemistry, physics, and natural cooling processes. Their observations about evaporation, insulation, and temperature helped improve methods of storing ice, while advances in agriculture expanded the variety of fruits and flowers available for frozen recipes. The result was a dazzling collection of desserts that delighted travellers from Europe. Many visitors had never tasted anything remotely similar. They returned home describing mysterious frozen sweets scented with roses and citrus, served in elegant gardens where fountains cooled the evening air. Those travellers carried home more than memories. They carried inspiration. Within a few centuries, Europe would begin transforming these Eastern ideas into something increasingly recognisable, one careful spoonful closer to the ice cream we know today. By the late Middle Ages and the beginning of the Renaissance, Europe's appetite for frozen desserts had grown enormously. There was just one inconvenient detail. Europe still hadn't figured out how to make them easily. The recipes arriving from the Islamic world fascinated wealthy families across Italy, Sicily, and southern Spain. Merchants returned from Mediterranean ports with stories of chilled fruit syrups, scented ices, and elegant desserts served in the courts of Eastern rulers. Cooks eagerly tried to recreate them, but success depended on one stubborn ingredient that refused to cooperate: ice. Unlike flour or wine, you couldn't simply purchase it whenever you felt like baking. It had to be harvested during winter, transported carefully, and stored with remarkable skill. Entire industries emerged around this frozen treasure. Workers cut enormous blocks from frozen lakes, rivers, and mountain slopes before packing them into deep ice houses insulated with straw, sawdust, and thick stone walls. A good ice house became one of the most valuable buildings on a wealthy estate. Without it, summer desserts remained little more than hopeful ideas. Italian cities soon became the leaders of this chilly revolution. Venice, Florence, and Naples welcomed merchants from every corner of the Mediterranean, bringing not only spices and silk, but also culinary knowledge gathered over centuries. Local chefs began combining Eastern techniques with Italy's abundance of lemons, oranges, cherries, peaches, and fragrant herbs. The result was an entirely new family of frozen treats. Fruit juices were sweetened with sugar, mixed with finely crushed ice, and stirred until they reached a smooth, delicate consistency. These early sorbettos were lighter than modern ice cream, but richer than simple flavoured snow. Every spoonful captured the flavour of fresh fruit, while offering the luxurious sensation of icy refreshment. The word itself likely traces its roots through the Arabic sharbat, reminding everyone that recipes often travel farther than armies ever do. Of course, frozen desserts remained reserved for society's highest circles. A noble banquet might feature musicians, dancers, roasted game, imported wines, and finally, a spectacular frozen course served in elegant silver bowls. Guests often reacted with genuine amazement. Some had never encountered anything so cold in the middle of July. Others simply admired the host's ability to provide such an expensive luxury. Imagine spending an entire evening eating roast pheasant, fresh figs, imported spices, and fine wine, only to have everyone gasp because someone walked into the room carrying a bowl of frozen lemon dessert. Human priorities have always been wonderfully predictable. As European cooks experimented further, another important discovery spread across elite kitchens. By surrounding metal containers with a mixture of crushed ice and salt, they could freeze liquids much faster than before. Custards, cream mixtures, and sweetened milk suddenly became realistic possibilities rather than impossible dreams. That simple scientific breakthrough changed everything. For the first time, frozen desserts were beginning to resemble what we would instantly recognize today as the earliest ancestors of true ice cream. The final transformation was now only a few generations away. After thousands of years of flavored snow, chilled syrups, and elegant fruit ices, the world was finally approaching the dessert that would conquer nearly every freezer on Earth. The missing ingredient was cream. For centuries, cooks had mastered the art of freezing water-based mixtures. They knew how to chill fruit juices, sweeten snow, and preserve ice through the hottest months. But dairy presented an entirely different challenge. Milk and cream behaved differently when frozen, often separating into unpleasant icy lumps unless handled with care. Long before the first great cities rose from the earth, before emperors ruled vast kingdoms, before philosophers debated ideas and poets filled scrolls with stories, humanity had already discovered something remarkable. We danced. Long before people could write their history, they were moving their bodies to tell it. Imagine a small group of hunter-gatherers gathered around a crackling fire some 20,000 years ago. The day's hunt is over. Spears lean against rocks. Children watch with wide eyes while elders beat sticks together in a steady rhythm. Someone begins stamping their feet. Another joins in. Soon the entire group is moving together, circling the fire beneath a sky crowded with stars. No one calls it choreography. No one has invented that word yet. But this is dance in one of its earliest forms. To us, dancing often feels like entertainment. Something you do at weddings, concerts, or perhaps after insisting that you definitely know how to salsa, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. For ancient people, dance was far more important. It celebrated successful hunts, welcomed newborn children, honoured the dead, prepared warriors for battle, asked the gods for rain, and strengthened the bonds that held small communities together. In a world without books, newspapers, or even widespread spoken languages between neighbouring tribes, movement itself became a universal form of communication. Everyone understood rhythm. Archaeologists have found cave paintings in Europe, Africa, India, and Australia, showing groups of people standing in rhythmic poses, with raised arms, bent knees, and linked hands. Although we cannot hear the music that accompanied these scenes, the images strongly suggest communal dancing existed thousands of years before history was ever written down. Music itself was wonderfully simple. Drums made from hollow logs echoed through valleys. Animal hide tambourines kept steady beats. Bones were carved into flutes, while stones struck together created sharp rhythms. Even clapping hands and stamping feet became instruments. You didn't need an orchestra when everyone present could become part of the performance. The dances themselves served practical purposes as well. Hunters sometimes mimicked the movements of deer, bison, or antelope before setting out, believing these performances would bring success. Warriors practiced coordinated steps that built trust and discipline within the group. Religious ceremonies used slow, repetitive movements to create a feeling of unity, allowing entire communities to share moments of celebration, grief, or hope. In many ways, dance became humanity's first shared language. You didn't need to understand another tribe's words to recognize joy, courage, mourning, or triumph when they were expressed through movement. As human settlements grew into villages and villages became civilizations, this ancient tradition evolved alongside them. Dance became more organized, more symbolic, and increasingly tied to religion, politics, and culture. Every great civilization would shape it differently, yet all inherited the same timeless instinct that had begun around countless prehistoric campfires. The story of ancient dance did not begin in a palace. It began with ordinary people moving together beneath the open sky, discovering that sometimes the body could say what words never could. As prehistoric villages grew into kingdoms, dance evolved alongside them. No civilization embraced this transformation more gracefully than ancient Egypt, where nearly every important moment in life, from birth to burial, from harvest to coronation, could be accompanied by music and movement. To the Egyptians, dance was never just entertainment. It was a way of speaking to the gods. Imagine arriving in Thebes during one of the great religious festivals. The streets are crowded long before sunrise. Merchants have closed their stalls. Families line the processional roads wearing freshly washed linen. Priests prepare sacred statues inside towering temples, while musicians warm up nearby, testing harps, long trumpets, drums, and the distinctive rattle of the sistrum, a bronze instrument whose shimmering sound was believed to please the goddess Hathor. Then the procession begins. Temple doors slowly open, and priests carry the image of the god through the city. Incense drifts through the air, flowers decorate the route, and dancers step forward in carefully rehearsed formations. Their movements are elegant rather than wild, every gesture timed to the steady rhythm of the musicians. This wasn't improvisation. Many dances followed traditions that had been preserved for generations, sometimes centuries. Every raised arm, every graceful turn, and every synchronized step carried symbolic meaning. The performers weren't simply entertaining the crowd. They were participating in a sacred ceremony that maintained harmony between humanity and the divine. One of the most important deities associated with music and dance was Hathor, goddess of love, joy, beauty, motherhood, and celebration. Her festivals were famous throughout Egypt, attracting enormous crowds who sang, feasted, and danced in her honor. The Egyptians believed that joyful music could lift the spirits of both people and gods alike. For once, throwing a good party was considered a religious duty. Professional dancers held respected positions within temples and royal courts. Many trained from childhood, mastering difficult routines that demanded flexibility, balance, and extraordinary coordination. Tomb paintings show dancers bending backward dramatically, spinning gracefully, and performing acrobatic movements that would still impress audiences today. Some performances were energetic celebrations, others were deeply emotional. Dance also played an important role in funerals. Special performers accompanied funeral processions, using slow, solemn movements to express grief and honor the deceased. Egyptians believed death was not an ending, but the beginning of another journey, and these ceremonial dances helped guide the soul safely into the afterlife. Even ordinary Egyptians danced during weddings, harvest festivals, military victories, and family celebrations. While temple ceremonies followed strict traditions, village festivities were far more relaxed. Friends clapped rhythms, children joined circles of dancers, and musicians encouraged everyone to participate. Whether performed inside the shadow of magnificent temples or in dusty village squares beside the Nile, dance united Egyptian society. It connected kings with farmers, priests with laborers, and the living with the gods. And while Egypt perfected sacred movement, another civilization across the Mediterranean would give dance an entirely different purpose. The Greeks would transform it into education, theatre, and even the training of warriors. If the Egyptians danced to honor the gods, the ancient Greeks believed dance could shape the perfect human being. To them, dancing wasn't simply something you watched. It was something every educated citizen was expected to understand. Imagine walking into a Greek city during one of its great religious festivals. Marble temples overlook the streets. The scent of olive oil and roasted lamb fills the air, and crowds gather inside open-air theatres carved into hillsides. Musicians begin playing the aulos, a double reed instrument with a surprisingly powerful sound, while the steady beat of drums echoes across the stone seats. Then the dancers appear. Unlike the highly formal temple dances of Egypt, Greek performers used movement to tell stories. Every leap, turn and gesture represented heroes, monsters, lovers, soldiers, or gods. Without elaborate scenery or modern special effects, the dancers themselves became the story. In many performances, the audience already knew the ending. They weren't watching to discover what happened. They were watching to see how the story would be brought to life. One of the greatest stages for these performances was the annual festival honouring Dionysus, the god of wine, celebration and theatre. During these festivals, entire cities gathered to watch tragedies, comedies and musical performances. Central to every production was the chorus, a group of singers and dancers who moved together in carefully synchronized patterns while commenting on the events unfolding before the audience. The chorus was much more than background decoration. It explained emotions, created tension, and sometimes even acted as the audience's voice, reacting with fear, excitement, or disbelief as heroes made terrible decisions. Ancient Greek drama would have felt strangely incomplete without it. Dance also played an important role far beyond the theatre. Greek children learned rhythm and coordinated movement as part of their education. Philosophers such as Plato believed dance helped develop discipline, harmony, and self-control. A graceful body reflected a well-ordered mind. In other words, physical movement wasn't separate from learning. It was part of becoming a responsible citizen. The Spartans took this idea even further. In Sparta, dance became military training. Young boys practiced coordinated movements that improved balance, endurance, and teamwork. Some war dances mimicked attacks, defensive formations, or shield movements, allowing soldiers to rehearse together while accompanied by music. These performances looked ceremonial, but beneath the rhythm lay practical lessons for the battlefield. Thankfully, modern office meetings have never adopted this approach. Imagine the weekly staff briefing ending with everyone performing synchronized spear drills. Not every Greek dance prepared men for war, however. Wedding celebrations featured joyful circle dances where families joined hands and celebrated the union of two households. Harvest festivals filled villages with music that continued well into the night. Sailors returning safely from dangerous voyages often honoured Poseidon through celebratory dances near the harbour, thanking the sea god for sparing their lives. By now, dance had become something remarkable. In Egypt, it connected humanity to the gods. In Greece, it educated children, entertained entire cities, strengthened armies, and gave life to literature itself. The Romans admired much of Greek culture, including its dance traditions. Yet, true to their character, they would reshape them into something larger, louder, and far more spectacular. The Romans admired many things about Greek culture, from philosophy to architecture. Dance was no exception. Yet, as with so many borrowed traditions, Rome transformed it into something distinctly Roman, bigger, louder, and designed to impress an audience. If Greece treated dance as an art, Rome turned it into a spectacle. Imagine arriving in Rome during the festival of Saturnalia, held every December in honour of Saturn, the god of agriculture. The city feels completely different. Shops are decorated with greenery, streets overflow with laughing crowds, and the usual rules of Roman society seem to loosen for a few precious days. Masters exchange gifts with servants. Gambling becomes acceptable. Wine flows freely, quite freely. The Romans rarely needed much encouragement to celebrate, and Saturnalia provided an official excuse. Throughout the city, musicians filled the air with the sounds of flutes, horns, tambourines, and drums, while groups of dancers wound their way through crowded streets. Unlike the carefully choreographed temple dances of Egypt, these public celebrations were lively and spontaneous. People clapped, sang, laughed, and often joined the performers as they passed. Of course, not every Roman approved. Many conservative senators believed excessive dancing reflected poor self-control. A respectable Roman citizen, especially an upper-class man, was expected to display dignity and discipline. Dancing too enthusiastically in public could earn curious looks or even damage one's reputation. It created an amusing contradiction. Romans loved watching dance. They simply preferred someone else doing it. Professional dancers filled that role perfectly. At lavish banquets hosted by wealthy senators and emperors, entertainers performed between courses while guests reclined on luxurious couches. Some dancers performed elegant routines accompanied by musicians, while others combined movement with juggling, acrobatics, or theatrical storytelling. Exotic performers from Greece, Egypt, Syria, and North Africa introduced styles unfamiliar to Roman audiences, making every banquet feel like a journey across the empire. One particularly popular form of entertainment became known as pantomime. Despite the modern meaning of the word, Roman pantomime involved neither silent clowns nor invisible walls. Instead, a single highly trained dancer performed entire mythological stories using only movement, facial expressions, and carefully controlled gestures. Speaking was unnecessary. A chorus sang the dialogue while musicians provided the emotional atmosphere, allowing the dancer to portray multiple characters in a single performance. Imagine switching from Hercules to Medusa to Zeus without changing costumes. That required astonishing skill. Dance also accompanied military triumphs. Victorious generals entering Rome often led magnificent processions featuring musicians, standard-bearers, captured treasures, exotic animals, and ceremonial dancers celebrating Rome's latest conquest. These performances weren't merely entertainment. They announced the empire's power to every spectator lining the streets. Whether performed in bustling marketplaces, elegant villas, grand theatres, or triumphal parades, dance became woven into Roman daily life. It entertained emperors, honoured the gods, and dazzled crowds across an empire stretching from Britain to Egypt. Yet while Rome celebrated spectacle, another great civilization viewed dance through an entirely different lens. In India, every movement of the hand, every glance of the eye, and every step carried a deeper meaning, transforming dance into a sacred language unlike any the ancient world had ever seen. While Roman audiences applauded dazzling performances in crowded theatres, dancers thousands of miles away in India stepped onto temple floors with a very different purpose. They were not performing for applause, they were dancing for the gods. In ancient India, dance was considered one of the highest forms of devotion, capable of expressing ideas too profound for ordinary speech. Every movement carried meaning. Every gesture told a story. Every performance became an act of worship as much as entertainment. Imagine entering a magnificent temple at sunrise. Incense drifts through the warm air. Oil lamps flicker against elaborately carved stone pillars covered with images of musicians, dancers, and divine beings. The soft sound of bells echoes through the sanctuary as priests begin their morning rituals. Then, almost silently, a dancer enters. She does not rush. Every step is deliberate. Every posture is perfectly balanced. Her hands begin forming intricate shapes. Her eyes shift with remarkable precision, and her facial expressions change from joy to sorrow to determination in only moments. To an unfamiliar visitor, the performance might simply appear beautiful, To someone raised in ancient India, it was an entire conversation. Many of these traditions were eventually recorded in the Natya Shastra, an extraordinary treatise believed to have been compiled around the beginning of the Common Era. More than a simple guide to dancing, it explained drama, music, stagecraft, costumes, emotions, and storytelling. It described how performers should move, where they should look, how they should breathe, and even how different emotions could be expressed through subtle changes in the face. Few ancient civilizations developed such a detailed manual for performance. The hand gestures alone, known as mudras, formed an elaborate symbolic language. One arrangement of the fingers could represent a flower, another symbolized fire. Others stood for birds, rivers, mountains, kings, love, anger, or entire conversations between characters. A skilled audience could understand much of the story without hearing a single spoken word. The eyes played an equally important role. Ancient teachers instructed dancers to direct their gaze with extraordinary precision. Looking upward suggested wonder or prayer. A quick sideways glance hinted at shyness or romance. Wide eyes could express fear, while lowered eyes conveyed humility or devotion. It was acting performed with the smallest muscles of the body. Training began young and demanded immense discipline. Students practiced balance, flexibility, rhythm, breathing, and countless gestures until every movement became second nature. Mastering the art could require years, sometimes decades, of dedicated study. There were no shortcuts. Even your eyebrows had homework. Many dancers served within temples, where they participated in religious ceremonies honoring deities such as Shiva, whose cosmic dance symbolized the endless cycles of creation and destruction. To witness these performances was to witness theology brought to life through movement. As India's sacred traditions flourished, another civilization farther east developed a very different philosophy of dance. In ancient China, graceful movement was not only beautiful, it reflected the harmony of the universe itself. While Indian dancers told sacred stories through symbolic gestures, ancient China approached dance with a different ideal: harmony. To the Chinese, dance was not simply entertainment or even solely a religious act. It was a reflection of order itself. Just as the heavens moved in perfect balance and the seasons followed one another without fail, so too should human movement be graceful, measured, and harmonious. A well-executed dance represented a well-ordered society. Imagine arriving at the imperial court during the Han dynasty. The palace stretches before you with sweeping roofs, painted columns, and vast ceremonial halls. Officials dressed in flowing silk robes stand in neat rows. Musicians quietly prepare bronze bells, stone chimes, bamboo flutes, zithers known as the guqin, and drums whose deep rhythms echo through the polished courtyards. Then the dancers enter. They do not rush across the stage. Instead, they glide almost effortlessly, each movement flowing into the next with remarkable precision. Their long silk sleeves drift through the air like clouds, extending every gesture into elegant arcs. The performance feels calm, controlled, almost dreamlike. Nothing appears accidental. Every step has been practiced countless times. Many of these performances were known as yayue, or elegant music, a ceremonial tradition that combined dance, music, and ritual. These spectacles accompanied important state occasions, royal banquets, diplomatic receptions, and ceremonies honoring ancestors or heaven itself. Confucius, the great philosopher, believed music and dance possessed enormous moral power. He argued that beautiful, orderly performances helped cultivate discipline, respect, and virtue throughout society. A ruler who encouraged proper ceremonies demonstrated wisdom. A kingdom whose music descended into chaos reflected political disorder. That may seem like a great deal of responsibility to place on a dance recital. Imagine forgetting one step and worrying you've accidentally weakened the empire. Court dancers trained for years to avoid exactly that possibility. Their performances often featured dozens, sometimes even hundreds, of participants moving together in perfect synchronization. Rows remained perfectly aligned. Sleeves rose and fell simultaneously. Every turn mirrored another dancer somewhere else in the formation, creating breathtaking geometric patterns across the palace floor. Beyond the imperial court, dance flourished during festivals celebrated by ordinary people. Villagers gathered during harvests, New Year festivities, and seasonal celebrations, performing lively folk dances accompanied by drums, cymbals, and cheerful singing. Dragon dances and early lion dances also began developing during ancient times, symbolizing good fortune, protection, and prosperity for the community. Military dance formed another fascinating tradition. Soldiers sometimes performed elaborate routines while carrying spears, halberds, shields, or banners. These displays demonstrated discipline, strength, and coordination, while preparing troops for the realities of battle. Like Sparta, China understood that rhythm could strengthen an army just as effectively as it entertained an audience. Whether performed before emperors inside magnificent palaces, or by farmers celebrating beneath open skies, dance became a powerful expression of Chinese civilization. And although Rome, India, and China each developed unique traditions, they were far from alone. Across Persia, Mesopotamia, and the Celtic world, countless other cultures found their own ways to celebrate life through movement, proving that the desire to dance belonged not to one civilization, but to humanity itself. By now, you've visited the temples of Egypt, the theatres of Greece, the banquets of Rome, the sacred halls of India, and the imperial courts of China. It would be easy to assume these were the world's great centres of dance. But they were only part of a much larger story. Almost every ancient civilization developed its own unique way of expressing joy, grief, victory, faith, and community through movement. Whether people lived beside mighty rivers, in wind-swept forests, or across endless deserts, they all seemed to arrive at the same conclusion. Life was simply better with music. Take ancient Persia, for example. Persian celebrations were famous throughout the ancient world. Royal banquets featured skilled musicians playing lutes, harps, and drums, while dancers performed graceful routines before nobles and foreign ambassadors. These performances emphasized elegance rather than dramatic storytelling. Flowing robes, delicate hand movements, and smooth turns reflected the refinement of one of history's wealthiest empires. Foreign visitors often described Persian courts as places where music never seemed far away. Of course, after several cups of excellent Persian wine, some guests probably believed they could dance just as well themselves. History offers very little evidence to support that confidence. Farther west, in Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, dance had already flourished for thousands of years before Persia rose to prominence. The Sumerians, Babylonians, and Assyrians celebrated religious festivals honouring gods such as Ishtar and Marduk, with grand public ceremonies filled with singing, drums, and carefully organised processions. Temple dancers accompanied priests during sacred rituals, while ordinary citizens celebrated seasonal festivals with far livelier performances in city squares. The purpose remained familiar. Dance brought communities together. It celebrated successful harvests, military victories, royal coronations, and religious holidays that united entire cities. Travel north into ancient Celtic lands, however, and the atmosphere changes completely. There are no marble temples or enormous palaces. Instead, imagine standing in a forest clearing as evening falls. A massive bonfire crackles in the centre, while warriors, farmers, craftsmen, and families gather in wide circles. Drums thunder steadily, horns echo through the trees. People clasp hands, leap over the fire's glow, and stamp their feet in rhythms that seem almost as old as the hills surrounding them. When people think about medieval Albania and the Ottoman Empire, one name usually dominates the conversation: Skanderbeg. His remarkable resistance deserves every bit of its legendary reputation. But while his story has been told countless times, another chapter of Albanian history often remains in the shadows. A chapter in which thousands of Albanians did not fight against the Sultan, but instead fought for him. Over the next 4 centuries, Albanian warriors would become some of the Ottoman Empire's most respected soldiers, commanders, governors, and even grand viziers. They would march from the mountains of the Balkans to the deserts of Arabia, from the walls of Vienna to the shores of North Africa, serving an empire that stretched across 3 continents. How did that happen? The answer begins in the late 14th century. At the time, Albania was not a united kingdom. Instead, it was divided among powerful noble families, each controlling its own territories, castles, and mountain passes. Families such as the Castrioti, Arianiti, Musaka, Dukagjini, and Thopia often competed with one another for influence. Alliances shifted constantly, sometimes sealed through marriage, sometimes broken by war. While they all shared the same rugged homeland, they rarely spoke with one political voice. This fragmentation created opportunities for a rapidly expanding power from the east. The Ottoman Empire had already crossed into Europe during the middle of the 14th century. After defeating Serbian forces at the Battle of Kosovo in 1389, Ottoman influence spread steadily throughout the Balkans. Rather than destroying every local ruler they encountered, the Ottomans frequently offered a practical choice: submit peacefully, keep much of your land and status, pay tribute, and provide military service, or resist. Many Albanian nobles chose different paths. Some fiercely opposed Ottoman expansion. Others negotiated alliances, hoping to preserve their families and estates in an uncertain political landscape. A few even switched sides more than once as fortunes changed, proving that medieval politics could be every bit as complicated as modern diplomacy. For ordinary Albanians, life continued much as before. Farmers cultivated olives, wheat, and vineyards. Shepherds guided their flocks across mountain pastures. Merchants carried goods along ancient roads, linking the Adriatic coast with the Balkan interior. Yet beneath this familiar routine, the political world was changing rapidly. Ottoman governors gradually established new administrative districts, tax systems, and military obligations. Fortresses changed hands. Garrisons appeared in strategic towns. Trade increasingly flowed through Ottoman-controlled territories, connecting Albania with distant cities such as Edirne, Bursa, and eventually Constantinople after its conquest in 1453. As Ottoman rule became more firmly established, military service emerged as one of the most important paths to opportunity. Some Albanians entered the Sultan's service voluntarily, attracted by regular pay, social advancement, and the possibility of earning land or high office. Others entered through different systems that the empire developed for recruiting talented young men. What began as a frontier shaped by conquest would soon become one of the Ottoman Empire's richest sources of exceptional soldiers, setting the stage for Albanian warriors to build reputations that echoed across Europe, Asia, and Africa for centuries to come. As Ottoman rule became firmly established across much of Albania, military service gradually evolved from an obligation into an opportunity. The empire needed capable soldiers. Albania had no shortage of them. The country's rugged mountains, narrow valleys, and isolated villages produced generations of men accustomed to hardship. From an early age, boys learned to ride horses across uneven terrain, climb steep hillsides, handle livestock, hunt in dense forests, and defend their families during local feuds. Life itself was a demanding instructor. By the time many young Albanian men reached adulthood, they already possessed the endurance, confidence, and resilience that professional armies valued. The Ottoman military recognized these qualities. Not every Albanian entered the army in the same way. Some enlisted voluntarily, particularly as the empire expanded and military service offered regular income, prestige, and the possibility of social advancement. For younger sons who stood little chance of inheriting family land, the Sultan's army promised something their villages often could not: a career. A successful soldier might earn wealth, land, influence, or even a place within the imperial administration. For an ambitious young man, that was an extraordinary opportunity. Others entered through the devshirme, often called the child levy. This system, introduced across parts of the Balkans, periodically selected Christian boys to serve the Ottoman state. Although it remains one of the most debated institutions in Ottoman history, its purpose was clear. The empire sought intelligent, healthy, and capable youths who could be educated for military or administrative service. The boys were taken from their families, converted to Islam, and immersed in years of rigorous education. Their new lives demanded absolute discipline. They learned Turkish, Arabic, and Persian. They studied reading, writing, mathematics, religion, military tactics, etiquette, and administration. Physical training occupied much of every day. Running, wrestling, archery, swordsmanship, spear drills, and endurance exercises transformed village boys into highly disciplined professionals. There were no shortcuts. The instructors expected perfection. A crooked formation, a neglected weapon, or a moment of carelessness earned immediate correction. The philosophy was simple. A soldier who lacked discipline in training could endanger hundreds of comrades in battle. Fortunately, medieval drill instructors were remarkably consistent. They believed shouting solved almost everything. Those who demonstrated exceptional intelligence often followed an even more prestigious path. Instead of becoming ordinary soldiers, they entered the imperial palace schools, where they trained as future officers, governors, diplomats, engineers, or administrators. Talent mattered more than noble birth, making the Ottoman system unusually open to advancement compared with many contemporary European kingdoms. For Albanian recruits, this created remarkable possibilities. Within a single generation, a shepherd's son could rise from an isolated mountain village to command armies or govern distant provinces. Not everyone reached such heights, of course. Most became professional soldiers serving in the empire's expanding military machine. Yet among these elite formations, one corps stood above all others. It was feared by enemies, admired by allies, and fiercely loyal to the Sultan. The Janissaries. Within their ranks, Albanian warriors would build a reputation that spread from the walls of Belgrade to the deserts of Egypt and beyond. By the time an Albanian recruit completed his years of training, he had become part of one of the most formidable military organizations in the world, the Janissary Corps. To the enemies of the Ottoman Empire, the sight alone was enough to inspire anxiety. Long ranks of disciplined infantry advanced with remarkable precision, their distinctive white felt caps rising above the crowd as military bands thundered behind them. Unlike many European armies, which often relied on temporary feudal levies, the Janissaries were full-time professional soldiers. War was not something they occasionally did. It was their entire profession. For many Albanians who entered the Corps, daily life changed completely. Gone were the isolated mountain villages and family farms. In their place came military barracks, strict schedules, and an organisation built on discipline above everything else. Each day followed a carefully organised routine. Before sunrise, the soldiers were already awake. Weapons were cleaned and inspected with meticulous care. Archery practice sharpened accuracy. Sword drills became almost automatic through endless repetition. Wrestling strengthened the body, while long marches built endurance. Firearms training gradually became just as important as traditional weapons, as muskets spread throughout the Ottoman army during the 15th and 16th centuries. Every movement had a purpose. Every hour served the goal of creating soldiers who would never break formation under pressure. Discipline extended far beyond the battlefield. For much of the Corps' early history, Janissaries lived together inside their barracks under strict regulations. Loyalty belonged first to the Sultan and second to the Corps itself. Camaraderie became essential because these men fought, trained, travelled, and often survived together for decades. Food even carried symbolic importance. Each company shared enormous cooking cauldrons from which meals were prepared and served. The cauldron became a symbol of unity, honour, and loyalty. Losing it in battle represented disgrace, while protecting it reflected the pride of the entire unit. It may be one of history's only armies where cookware became almost as sacred as the battle flag. The Janissaries quickly earned a fearsome reputation across Europe. At Constantinople in 1453, disciplined Ottoman infantry helped breach the walls that had protected the Byzantine capital for nearly 1,000 years. During campaigns in Hungary, Serbia, Rhodes, and the Middle East, European commanders repeatedly commented on the Janissaries' remarkable steadiness under fire. Among their ranks were many soldiers of Albanian origin. While exact numbers remain impossible to determine, historical records show Albanians served throughout the Corps for centuries, with many rising to become officers, commanders, and influential figures within the military hierarchy. Their reputation for courage, endurance, and adaptability made them valuable participants in campaigns stretching from the Danube River to the Persian frontier. For these soldiers, military success brought more than honour. Promotion meant higher pay, greater influence, and opportunities unavailable almost anywhere else in Europe. Some Janissaries eventually left the battlefield altogether, entering government service or provincial administration. Others remained soldiers for life, but regardless of where their careers led, they all shared one experience. They belonged to an elite force that stood at the heart of one of history's greatest empires, and soon those Albanian Janissaries would march far beyond the Balkans, fighting on battlefields scattered across 3 continents. The Janissaries were only as famous as the campaigns they fought. For Albanian soldiers serving the Sultan, those campaigns seemed endless. One year they might be marching through the muddy plains of Hungary. A few years later, they could be crossing the mountains of eastern Anatolia toward Persia. Before long, they might find themselves sailing across the Mediterranean to North Africa, or standing guard outside the holy cities of Arabia. Few men of the 15th and 16th centuries travelled farther. Imagine a young recruit from the hills near Kruja or Berat. As a child, the Adriatic coast may have seemed unimaginably distant. Yet after joining the Ottoman army, he could spend decades marching thousands of miles across lands he had never imagined existed. His world expanded with every campaign. One of the empire's most important frontiers lay along the Danube River, where Ottoman armies repeatedly clashed with the Kingdom of Hungary and later the Habsburg Empire. Albanian Janissaries fought during some of the largest sieges of the age, including Belgrade, Mohacs, Buda, and Vienna. These were not small medieval skirmishes. Some Ottoman armies numbered well over 100,000 men, accompanied by engineers, artillery crews, cavalry, camel caravans, physicians, craftsmen, and supply wagons stretching for miles. Moving such an army resembled transporting an entire city. Unfortunately, unlike modern tourists, these travellers generally announced their arrival with cannons. Campaigns could last for months. Soldiers marched 20 or 30 kilometres a day carrying weapons, ammunition, food, spare clothing, and personal equipment. Summer heat baked the roads into dust, while autumn rains transformed them into deep mud. Disease often claimed more lives than combat itself. Dysentery, fever, contaminated water, and exhaustion remained constant enemies. Victory depended just as much on endurance as courage. Yet Europe represented only one theatre of war. To the east, Albanian soldiers joined campaigns against the Safavid Empire of Persia. These expeditions carried them across high mountain passes, barren plateaus, and deserts where water became more valuable than gold. The fighting differed greatly from European battlefields. Cavalry raids, long-distance marches, and difficult supply lines tested every soldier's resilience. Farther south, Ottoman forces expanded into Syria, Egypt, and North Africa. Albanian troops participated in campaigns that secured Cairo, defended the Red Sea, and protected trade routes linking the Mediterranean with the Indian Ocean. Some even found themselves stationed in distant garrisons from Algiers to Baghdad, serving years far from the mountains where they had been born. Military success earned respect throughout the empire. Ottoman chroniclers frequently praised soldiers who remained disciplined under fire, and Albanian warriors developed a reputation for toughness, reliability, and determination. Officers valued men who could endure long campaigns without losing cohesion, qualities that proved invaluable in an empire fighting on multiple fronts simultaneously. By now, many Albanian soldiers had spent their entire adult lives in uniform. Some would never return home. Others returned decorated with honours, wealth, and experience gathered across 3 continents. For a fortunate few, however, the battlefield became only the beginning of an even more extraordinary journey. Their next promotion would not lead to another army. It would lead to the highest offices of the Ottoman Empire itself. While the Janissaries became famous as the Ottoman Empire's elite infantry, they were only one half of a much larger military machine. The other half thundered across the battlefield on horseback. These were the Sipahis, the empire's cavalrymen, and among them were thousands of Albanians whose riding skills had been shaped long before they ever wore the Sultan's colours. In medieval Albania, horses were more than a luxury. Mountain roads, steep valleys, and long distances between villages made riding an everyday necessity for many noble families and wealthier landowners. Young men learned to handle horses almost as naturally as they learned to walk. They hunted from horseback, travelled through dangerous mountain passes, and, when conflict erupted between rival clans, fought while mounted. The Ottoman Empire quickly recognised this valuable tradition. Unlike the Janissaries, who received regular salaries, many Sipahis served under the Timar system. In return for military service, the Sultan granted them the right to collect taxes from specific pieces of land. These grants did not make them owners of the land itself. Instead, they received its income on the condition that they remained ready for war whenever the Sultan called. It was a practical arrangement. The empire gained experienced cavalry without paying enormous standing salaries, while the Sipahis gained status, income, and a direct stake in maintaining the empire's stability. When war came, every Sipahi was expected to arrive fully equipped. That meant providing not only his horse but also his armour, weapons, and sometimes additional mounted retainers depending on the value of his land grant. Wealthier cavalrymen often appeared wearing chainmail reinforced with steel plates, carrying long lances, curved sabres, bows, shields, and pistols during later centuries as firearms became increasingly common. Maintaining this equipment was expensive. Keeping a warhorse healthy proved even more demanding. Unlike modern vehicles, horses refused to start each morning unless they had been fed, watered, groomed, and carefully looked after. They also had the inconvenient habit of developing personalities. Some remained calm in battle. Others believed charging directly toward flying cannonballs was an excellent career choice. On campaign, the Sipahis served as the army's fast-moving striking force. They scouted ahead of the main army, protected supply lines, pursued retreating enemies, and launched devastating cavalry charges when the opportunity appeared. Their mobility allowed Ottoman commanders to gather intelligence quickly and react to changing battlefield conditions far faster than infantry ever could. Albanian cavalrymen earned particular respect for their endurance during long campaigns across the Balkans. Accustomed to difficult mountain terrain from childhood, many adapted easily to demanding marches and harsh conditions that exhausted less experienced riders. Some eventually rose beyond the battlefield. Successful Sipahis could become provincial governors, military commanders, or trusted administrators responsible for managing entire districts of the empire. For ambitious Albanian horsemen, the saddle became more than a place to fight. It became the first step toward power, and no group would demonstrate that possibility more dramatically than the remarkable Albanian families who climbed from military service to the very summit of Ottoman government. By now, Albanian warriors had earned a formidable reputation on the battlefield. But for some, military success became only the beginning. Unlike many European kingdoms, where noble birth often determined how far a man could rise, the Ottoman Empire offered something unusual for its time. Talent, loyalty, and ability could carry a capable soldier astonishingly high through the ranks of government. In rare cases, all the way to the top. Imagine serving as a young officer during a successful campaign. Your commander notices your discipline. You are promoted. A few years later, you prove yourself managing supplies or negotiating with local leaders. Another promotion follows. Before long, you are governing a province hundreds of miles from where you were born. That path was not common, but it was possible, and a surprising number of Albanians followed it. Throughout the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, men of Albanian origin became governors, admirals, provincial commanders, diplomats, judges, and members of the Sultan's inner administration. Their military experience made them valuable administrators because they understood logistics, discipline, taxation, and the practical realities of governing distant territories. The empire rewarded competence. If you could keep order, collect taxes fairly, suppress revolts, and defend your province, the Sultan cared far more about your performance than your birthplace. At the summit of Ottoman government stood the Grand Vizier, often described as the Sultan's chief minister. The Grand Vizier effectively directed the daily administration of the empire. He supervised military campaigns, managed foreign diplomacy, oversaw finances, and coordinated the enormous bureaucracy that governed millions of subjects across Europe, Asia, and Africa. It was one of the most powerful political offices anywhere in the world. Remarkably, numerous Grand Viziers came from Albanian families. Among the most famous were members of the Köprülü family, whose origins lay in Albania. Beginning with Köprülü Mehmed Pasha in the 17th century, this remarkable dynasty produced several Grand Viziers in succession. At a time when the Ottoman Empire faced serious military setbacks and internal instability, the Köprülüs introduced sweeping reforms, restored discipline within the army, strengthened provincial administration, and temporarily revived the empire's fortunes. Historians often describe this period as the Köprülü era. Few families exercised greater influence over Ottoman politics. Of course, such immense responsibility came with enormous risks. A Grand Vizier enjoyed extraordinary authority, but he also served entirely at the Sultan's pleasure. Success brought honours, wealth, and prestige. Failure could mean immediate dismissal, imprisonment, or in some cases, execution. It was perhaps the world's least relaxing management position. One poor campaign might cost you far more than your annual performance review. Yet ambitious Albanian officials continued accepting these responsibilities because the opportunities were unmatched. Their careers demonstrated that military service in the Ottoman Empire could become a pathway not only to battlefield glory, but also to shaping the policies of one of history's largest empires. Among these remarkable figures, however, a handful stood above even the rest. Their names would become known from Istanbul to Cairo, leaving legacies that stretched far beyond the Ottoman capital itself. By the 17th century, Albanian soldiers were no longer simply serving in the Ottoman army. Some were commanding it. Over the previous 300 years, generations of Albanian warriors had climbed through the military ranks, proving themselves on battlefields stretching from Hungary to Yemen. Now, a handful of extraordinary individuals began influencing the direction of the entire empire. None became more famous than Köprülü Mehmed Pasha. Born into a family of Albanian origin in the late 16th century, Köprülü started his career much like countless other Ottoman officials, with patience, discipline, and years of service. He held various administrative and military posts before, in 1656, Sultan Mehmed IV appointed him Grand Vizier. The timing could hardly have been worse. The Ottoman Empire was struggling. Corruption weakened the government. Military defeats had damaged morale. Provincial revolts threatened stability, while political intrigue filled the imperial court. Many believed the empire had entered irreversible decline. Köprülü disagreed. Upon accepting the office, he demanded extraordinary authority. The Sultan granted him wide powers to reform the state, and Köprülü wasted no time. Corrupt officials were dismissed. Financial administration improved. Discipline returned to the army. Provincial governors who ignored imperial authority were replaced or punished. His methods were often severe, but they were undeniably effective. Within a few years, the empire had regained much of the stability it desperately needed. Even more remarkable, Köprülü transformed his success into a family legacy. His son, Fazıl Ahmed Pasha, succeeded him as Grand Vizier and proved equally capable. Under his leadership, Ottoman armies captured the great fortress of Candia on Crete after one of the longest sieges in European history, and continued successful campaigns in Central Europe. Later members of the Köprülü family also reached the office of Grand Vizier, creating one of the most influential political dynasties in Ottoman history. Few families anywhere in Europe exercised such sustained control over a major empire. The Albanian contribution extended far beyond Constantinople. Perhaps the most famous Albanian-born ruler outside the Ottoman capital was Muhammad Ali Pasha. Born in Kavala, a city with a large Albanian population, he arrived in Egypt as an Ottoman officer at the beginning of the 19th century. Through remarkable political skill, military talent, and determination, he eventually became the governor of Egypt. Once in power, Muhammad Ali transformed the province. He reorganized the army using modern European training methods, expanded agriculture, encouraged industry, built schools, strengthened the navy, and turned Egypt into one of the strongest regions of the Ottoman world. Although he officially remained loyal to the Sultan, he ruled with considerable independence and founded a dynasty that governed Egypt for well over a century. These men demonstrated something extraordinary.